The air is still. Not the stillness of an ordinary night, but the deep, pre-dawn quiet of a world that has not yet learned what morning will bring. You are standing at the edge of something ancient, something so old that the very rocks beneath your feet hold the memory of it in their layers, compressed and dark, patient as the earth itself. The sky above you is a shade of violet you have no name for. Stars burn in their slow configurations, indifferent to what is about to happen below them. It is roughly 252 million years before this moment of yours. You are somewhere in the southern hemisphere, on a broad, shallow coast where warm seawater laps against a shelf of pale limestone. Behind you, a dry interior stretches toward distant uplands, scrubbed with low plants that look almost familiar but are not quite anything you could name. Ahead, the sea is calm. Small creatures move in the shallows, things with shells, things with soft bodies, things that have been living here, in more or less this same form, for a very long time. Breathe in. The air tastes of salt and something faintly mineral, a chalky dryness that catches at the back of the throat. The temperature is warm, warmer than it ought to be, and has been for a while now, though nothing here knows that. The creatures in the shallows do not know it. The low plants behind you do not know it. The wide, uncomplicated world of the late Permian period goes about its business without any awareness that it is, in this moment, standing at the edge of the longest silence in the history of life on Earth. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the sound of the water reach you. Let the warmth of the air settle around your shoulders. This is the world before everything changed. And tonight, very slowly, we will walk through what happened next. Welcome. Settle in wherever you are. Pull the covers a little closer, or let your weight sink more fully into whatever is holding you right now. Tonight we are going on a journey that begins not with the dinosaurs themselves, but with the world they inherited, a broken, silent, slowly healing world that had to be remade almost entirely before anything like a dinosaur could exist within it. The story of the rise of the dinosaurs is not a story of triumph arriving from nowhere. It is a story of aftermath. It is a story of what grows in the spaces left behind when almost everything else is gone. And it is, in its own slow and geological way, one of the most remarkable stories that this planet has ever told. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. We will move through this story gently. There is no hurry here. Deep time does not hurry. It accumulates, one layer of sediment at a time, 1,000 years folded quietly into the next, until what seems impossible has simply become the way things are. By the time our story is finished, the world will be unrecognizable, warmer, stranger, greener, and alive with creatures that carry the word dinosaur like an inheritance earned through long patience. For now, return your attention to that quiet coastline. To the soft sound of ancient water. To the warmth that sits a little too heavily on the air. Something is coming. It has been building for a long time, deep in the earth, in the slow movement of continental plates, in the chemistry of a changing atmosphere, in the gradual tipping of balances so vast that no single creature alive can feel them shifting. But we can feel them now, looking back. We can stand at the edge of what is about to happen and understand what the creatures of the late Permian could not, that this world is almost over, and that what replaces it will take 50 million years to fully arrive. Let your breathing slow. Let the sound of that ancient sea be with you for a moment before we begin. The story of the dinosaurs starts here, in this stillness, in this warmth, in this world that is about to end. There is a layer in the rock record that geologists call the Permian-Triassic boundary. It is not a dramatic-looking thing. It is a thin band of dark sediment, sometimes less than a centimeter thick, compressed between the pale limestone of the late Permian and the different, stranger rock of the early Triassic. But within that thin band, within that centimeter of darkness, is encoded the largest biological catastrophe in the history of complex life on Earth. Scientists call it the end-Permian mass extinction. In plainer language, people sometimes call it the Great Dying. Both names are correct. Both, in different ways, fail to fully hold what happened. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what the Permian world was. By the late Permian period, roughly 252 million years ago, life had been evolving in the seas for more than 300 million years. The oceans were full. Not full the way modern oceans are full, but full in a different, Permian way, layered with organisms that had found their niches over millions of years, creatures that filtered the water, creatures that built reefs, creatures that crawled across the seafloor and buried themselves in sand and rose in elaborate spiraling shells toward the light filtering down from above. The brachiopods were everywhere. They looked a little like clams, with two hinged shells, but they were not clams at all. They were something older and more fundamental, a body plan that had been working since the Cambrian period, more than 300 million years before the Permian's end. They covered the seafloors in vast communities, opening their shells to filter particles of food from the water, closing again at any disturbance. They had survived every extinction event that had come before. They had been here so long that the ocean without them would have seemed impossible. The coral reefs were ancient too, though the corals of the Permian were different from the ones we know today, rugose corals, tabulate corals, organisms that built their calcium carbonate structures slowly, colony by colony, over thousands of years, creating complex three-dimensional habitats that other creatures moved through and sheltered within. These reefs were not small local features. They were extensive, reaching across shallow tropical seas, as significant to the Permian Ocean as coral reefs are to ours. And then there were the cephalopods, ammonoids, nautiloids, animals that moved through the water column with their coiled shells behind them, jet-propelling themselves through the sea with a muscular siphon, hunting and being hunted in the open water. And the trilobites, ancient beyond reckoning, some of the oldest complex animals on Earth, their segmented bodies and compound eyes a design so successful that it had persisted for 270 million years. And the sea urchins, the bryozoans, the crinoids, feathery, graceful creatures that looked like underwater flowers, anchored to the seafloor and extending their arms to catch whatever food the current brought past them. On land, the Permian world was dominated by a group of animals called the synapsids. These were not dinosaurs, not even close to dinosaurs, though they would eventually give rise to something far more significant, mammals. The synapsids of the Permian were remarkable in their own right. Some of them, the dicynodonts, were stocky, barrel-bodied herbivores that cropped low vegetation with their beaked mouths. Others, the gorgonopsians, were predators of surprising sophistication, with large blade-like teeth and a posture that was already beginning to shift away from the sprawling gait of earlier reptiles towards something more upright and efficient. The Permian world was not simple. It was not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. It was complex and deeply layered, the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Every ecological role was filled. Every niche had its specialist. The world was, in the language of ecologists, saturated. There was no easy room for new entrants, no empty spaces waiting to be occupied. Life had sorted itself out. The arrangement seemed stable. It seemed, from any reasonable point of view, as though it would continue. It did not continue. What ended it was not an asteroid impact. That distinction belongs to a different extinction, 66 million years later. What ended the Permian world was something that came from within the Earth itself, something that had been building slowly, accumulating over hundreds of thousands of years before it reached the scale at which it could unmake a world. What ended the Permian was the Siberian Traps. The Siberian Traps are a vast geological feature in what is now northern Russia, a region of flood basalt, the product of one of the largest volcanic events in the planet's history. For somewhere between 40,000 and a million years, lava poured from deep fissures in the earth, not in explosive volcanic eruptions of the kind that humans find dramatic, but in vast, slow outpourings, sheet after sheet of molten rock spreading across a landscape the size of a continent. The area eventually covered by these lava flows was roughly equivalent to modern Europe. In terms of raw volume, the lava output was almost incomprehensibly large. But it was not the lava itself that killed the world. Lava is destructive on a local scale, but the Permian world was large. What killed the world was what the lava released into the atmosphere. Volcanic eruptions of this scale produce enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, gases that interact with the atmosphere in ways that are, over geological time, decisive. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and enough of it will warm the planet. Sulfur dioxide, when it dissolves in water in the upper atmosphere, produces sulfuric acid, which falls as acid rain. Both of these effects played a role in the end-Permian extinction. But there was a third factor, one that may have been the decisive blow. As the lava flowed across the Siberian landscape, it passed through vast deposits of coal, limestone, and evaporite minerals, sedimentary rocks full of carbon and other volatile compounds. The heat of the lava baked these deposits, releasing their stored carbon and other chemicals into the atmosphere in addition to the gases from the eruptions themselves. Some scientists believe this process may have triggered the release of methane hydrates from the seafloor as well, frozen deposits of methane, locked in ice at the bottom of the ocean, that could be destabilized by warming temperatures and would, if released, add yet more greenhouse gas to an already overloaded atmosphere. The result was a runaway warming event. Ocean temperatures rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions. The chemistry of the ocean water changed as it absorbed carbon dioxide, becoming more acidic. Deep water circulation, which normally carries oxygenated water down to the seafloor, slowed and eventually failed in some areas, creating vast dead zones where the water held too little oxygen to support complex life. The reefs began to dissolve. The brachiopods began to die. The trilobites, which had survived every previous catastrophe, died too, this time for good. You can feel it from here, from this place of quiet and distance, without the weight of fear that the creatures of that time carried without knowing they carried it. You can feel the slowness of it, the accumulation of change over thousands of years, each individual year perhaps not noticeably different from the one before, but the decades and centuries tilting irrevocably toward a world that could no longer sustain what lived in it. There were no last moments of awareness. There was no moment of understanding. There was only the gradual narrowing of the possible, the shrinking of the livable, until what had been a world was something much, much smaller. In the ocean, somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species went extinct. Think about what that number means. Think about the coral reefs, the brachiopod beds, the swimming cephalopods, the feathery crinoids. Think about the trilobites, those ancient animals that had been present in the seas since before any creature had evolved to walk on land. Nearly all of it was gone. The seafloor that had been complex and crowded and alive became, in geological terms almost instantaneously, a wasteland of mud and bacteria and chemical sediment. On land, the losses were similarly staggering. Perhaps 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species were lost. The Gorgonopsians, those sophisticated predators that had seemed so promising, were entirely gone. Many of the Dicynodonts were gone. The elaborate, interconnected web of Permian land life, predator and prey, plant and animal, the whole fabric of ecological relationships that had been woven over millions of years, was torn almost entirely apart. The world that remained on the other side of the Great Dying was a different place. Not immediately, not all at once. Extinction on this scale takes thousands of years to fully unfold, and recovery takes millions. But the direction of change was irreversible. The Permian world was over. What came next would have to build itself from almost nothing, from the few survivors that had somehow made it through the narrowing, into whatever space the post-extinction world had to offer. In the geology of that thin dark band, in the silence that it represents, there is something that the rest of this story depends on entirely. Because the emptiness that the Great Dying left behind was not simply a tragedy. It was also, in the most literal sense possible, an opportunity. A world with 90% of its species gone is a world with 90% of its ecological space empty, unoccupied, available. The few survivors that crawled out of the Permian into the Triassic would find themselves in a world with almost no competition, almost no established hierarchies, almost no filled niches to contend with. The Great Dying had cleared the table. Now something new would have to sit down at it. And in the slow, patient, accumulating way of all deep time, something new would. Let yourself rest in that thought for a moment. The darkness of the end-Permian is not the end of the story. It is the precondition for everything that follows. The silence between the notes is what makes the music possible. And the silence that fell over the late Permian world was, in geological terms, about to be filled with something extraordinary. Rest now in the quietness of that long interval. The world is still. The sea is still warming. The sediment is still settling. But life, as it always has, is still here, in small and stubborn forms, waiting in the darkness for the conditions that will let it begin again. Imagine walking across the early Triassic landscape. Not immediately after the extinction event, there was no single moment when the world ended and another began, but perhaps 100,000 years into the Triassic, when the worst of the volcanic activity has subsided and the atmosphere is beginning, very slowly, to find a new equilibrium. What you would see, and what you would smell, and what you would feel beneath your feet, would be almost unrecognizable compared to the world that had existed before. The first thing you might notice is the silence. Not an absolute silence. The wind is still there, the water is still there, small insects and other invertebrates are still making their small sounds, but the layered complexity of biological noise that characterizes a healthy ecosystem is almost entirely absent. No large animals calling from the tree line. No chorus of frogs from the swamps. No birds, because birds have not yet evolved. The soundscape of the early Triassic is thin and sparsely populated, a sketch where a fully realized painting once existed. The landscape itself is also strangely simplified. The elaborate plant communities of the Permian, the glossopterid forests, the seed ferns, the complex understories of smaller plants, have been largely replaced by a scrubby, low-lying vegetation dominated by a single fern species. Scientists examining rock formations from this period have noted what they call the lycopsid spike and the fern spike, brief, dramatic moments in the fossil record where the diversity of plant life collapses and a single opportunistic species expands to fill almost every available habitat, because it is the only thing tough and generalist enough to survive. This is what extreme ecological disruption looks like in the plant record. One plant, or a very small number of plants, growing everywhere because everything else is gone. It is botanically bleak in the way that a field recovering from a wildfire can be bleak, not lifeless, but uniformly, monotonously alive with only one kind of life, the kind that moves fastest into emptied space without caring too much about the conditions it finds there. The soils of the early Triassic have changed too. Healthy soils are not simple things. They are complex communities of fungi, bacteria, invertebrates, and plant roots that have co-evolved over millions of years into systems of extraordinary sophistication, capable of retaining moisture, cycling nutrients, and supporting the growth of large plants. When the plant communities that maintain these soils are removed, as they largely were by the end-Permian extinction, the soils themselves begin to degrade. Fossils from the early Triassic show what geologists describe as a shift from meandering river systems to braided river systems, a characteristic signature of landscapes with degraded soil cover where water erosion runs unchecked across bare or sparsely vegetated ground. You can picture it, wide, flat floodplains crossed by multiple shallow, shifting channels of muddy water, their banks unstable, their courses changing with each rain. The landscape lacks the roots that would hold it in place, lacks the soil structure that would absorb rainfall and release it slowly. Everything moves more abruptly, more chaotically, without the network of biological holding that a healthy ecosystem provides. It is a reminder that what we call a landscape is not just rock and soil and water, it is the accumulated work of millions of years of biological modification, and when that work is undone, the landscape itself becomes something different. The oceans in the early Triassic are similarly diminished. The vast majority of marine species are gone. What remains is a much simplified community of organisms, bacteria, stromatolites, layered mats of cyanobacteria that had been the dominant life form on Earth for billions of years before complex life evolved and had been largely displaced by that complex life, and a small number of surviving animal groups. The recovery of the marine ecosystem would be long and uneven, with false starts and setbacks, complicated by the continuing instability of ocean chemistry and temperature. Some regions of the early Triassic Ocean may have had water temperatures near the surface that were lethal to many forms of complex life. Certain parts of the tropical ocean, particularly in the equatorial regions, may have been what scientists call dead zones in a very direct sense, bodies of water too warm and too oxygen poor to support the metabolism of vertebrates or most invertebrates. The distribution of marine fossils from the early Triassic shows a striking pattern. Life, where it survived at all, clustered toward the higher latitudes, where temperatures remained lower and the water retained more of its oxygen. This geographical displacement of surviving life is significant. It would shape the patterns of recovery, determining which groups had access to which resources, which lineages found themselves in environments where they could grow and diversify. The survivors of the Great Dying were not spread evenly across the globe. They were concentrated in particular refugia, places that, by accident of geography and climate, had remained just barely livable when the rest of the world was not. Among the vertebrate survivors on land, the most significant were a group of animals called the Lystrosaurus. These were dicynodonts, part of the synapsid lineage that had been diverse and abundant in the Permian, and they had survived the extinction event in remarkable numbers. Lystrosaurus fossils are found across the early Triassic in enormous quantities and extraordinary geographic distribution. From Antarctica to Russia to China to South Africa, they appear in almost every continental deposit of the Right Age. This is a creature that, for a brief geological interval, was perhaps the most common large vertebrate on Earth. Lystrosaurus was not a spectacular animal, by any measure that a human observer might use. It was roughly the size and general shape of a large dog, with a barrel-shaped body, a blunt, beaked face, and a pair of large tusks that it used to dig up roots and tubers. It walked with a somewhat sprawling gait, not entirely unlike a modern reptile, though its relationship to mammals means it was in some physiological ways more sophisticated than it looked. It was, in the ecological terminology, a generalist herbivore, not specialized for any particular food source, not dependent on any particular habitat type, able to eat a wide range of plant material and survive in a wide range of conditions. These traits, which might have made Lystrosaurus unremarkable in the complex, competitive world of the late Permian, made it superbly suited to the simplified, stressed world of the early Triassic. In a world where most plants had disappeared and the surviving vegetation was tough, fibrous, and nutritionally poor, a herbivore that could dig for roots and process almost anything it found in the ground had an enormous advantage. In a world where predators had been decimated and competition was minimal, a moderately sized animal with no highly specialized dietary requirements could thrive with very little effort. You can picture Lystrosaurus in this early Triassic landscape, moving slowly across a flat floodplain, its beaked face working at the soil, pulling up whatever growing things it can find. It is not a dramatic animal. It does not inspire the kind of awe that the large predators of later periods will. But it is alive, and in this reduced and tenuous world, being alive is extraordinary enough. It represents the persistence of life through the worst crisis the animal kingdom has ever faced. What is remarkable about Lystrosaurus is not just that it survived, but the degree to which it survived. In many early Triassic deposits, Lystrosaurus fossils make up more than 90% of all vertebrate remains. This is ecological dominance of a kind that has no real modern equivalent. Imagine a world in which 9 out of 10 vertebrate animals you encountered were the same species, the same body plan, the same way of moving through the world. It is ecologically simplistic to a degree that we would find almost claustrophobic if we could experience it directly. And yet it is life, persisting in the only form that the post-extinction world could currently sustain. Alongside Lystrosaurus, a small number of other survivors were making their way through the early Triassic. Some Archosaur precursors, relatives of the lineage that would eventually give rise to both crocodilians and dinosaurs, were present in small numbers, largely unremarkable in these early days, mixed in among the more abundant synapsids. Some small, insectivorous reptiles were present too, moving through the low fern cover in search of the invertebrates that had themselves survived in reduced but not eliminated numbers. And in the rivers and lakes, some fish had made it through, along with various aquatic invertebrates, maintaining at least a thread of ecological complexity in the freshwater systems even when the land above was so impoverished. There is something meditation-worthy in this picture of the early Triassic, this simplified, quiet, slowly recovering world. It is not a world of drama. It is a world of patience. The work being done here is the work of survival, of holding on, of being present in a diminished world and continuing to eat and breathe and reproduce with whatever resources are available. It is not glamorous work. But it is the work that makes everything else possible. The early Triassic lasted roughly 5 to 7 million years, a brief interval by geological standards, though unimaginably long by any human measure. During this time, the world was recovering, but slowly and unevenly, with setbacks and complications. The atmosphere was still warmer than it had been in the Permian. The oceans were still chemically stressed. The soils were still degraded. The plant communities were still working their way back toward complexity. There was no single turning point, no moment at which things suddenly became better. There was only the long, incremental process of healing, measured in millions of years, proceeding at its own pace regardless of whether anything alive could perceive it or not. And slowly, so slowly that no individual creature could sense the change, the world was becoming something new. The empty ecological space left by the Great Dying was not going to remain empty. Life does not tolerate vacancy. Every niche that opens is, in geological time, an opportunity, a problem to be solved, a shape that evolutionary pressure will eventually fill. The 5 million years of the early Triassic were the years in which life was finding new solutions to the new conditions, building new ecological frameworks from the survivors that remained, setting in motion the evolutionary experiments that would eventually lead, step by patient step, toward the age of dinosaurs. But we are not there yet. The world is still quiet. The ferns are still spreading across the bare hillsides. The Lystrosaurus is still moving through the muddy lowlands. The rivers are still braided and unstable. Let yourself rest in this quietness for a moment, in this long interval between what was and what will be. The world is breathing. The world is healing. And far in the future of this moment, something is beginning to stir. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Life, it turns out, is more stubborn than extinction. This is perhaps the most fundamental lesson that the fossil record has to teach. Every mass extinction in Earth's history, and there have been 5 of the largest, and dozens of smaller ones, has been followed by recovery, by diversification, by the eventual reoccupation of emptied ecological space. The recoveries are not quick. They do not happen in human lifetimes, or in the lifetimes of civilizations, or even in intervals that can be meaningfully compared to anything in human experience. But they happen. They always happen. Life finds the available resources and expands to fill them, one generation at a time. The early Triassic recovery is one of the most studied and debated recoveries in paleontological history, partly because the extinction event that preceded it was so large and partly because the recovery was, by the standards of mass extinctions, unusually slow. Most mass extinctions are followed by a relatively rapid ecological rebound, a few million years of simplified communities followed by an explosion of new diversity as survivors diversify to fill vacated niches. The end-Permian recovery took longer, considerably longer, and paleontologists have spent decades trying to understand why. One significant factor was the persistence of unstable environmental conditions. The Siberian Traps volcanism did not end cleanly at the Permian-Triassic boundary. Volcanic activity continued, in varying intensity, into the early Triassic, releasing continuing pulses of greenhouse gases into an atmosphere that was already struggling to find equilibrium. This meant that the survivors of the Great Dying were not simply dealing with the aftermath of a catastrophe, they were dealing with conditions that continued to be difficult, that fluctuated and occasionally deteriorated even as the general trend was toward stabilization. The ocean chemistry, in particular, remained problematic. Carbonate chemistry, the balance of dissolved carbons and carbonates in seawater that determines whether organisms can build calcium carbonate shells, was repeatedly disrupted in the early Triassic, making it difficult for shelled organisms to grow and maintain their protective structures. This contributed to the extended delay in the recovery of marine invertebrates, the very groups that had formed the foundation of Permian ocean ecosystems and would eventually form the foundation of Triassic ones as well. But life was not passive in the face of these difficulties. Even in the simplified, stressed world of the early Triassic, evolutionary processes were continuing, working on the raw material of the survivors and shaping new solutions to new problems. The most important of these early evolutionary experiments were happening in the Archosaur lineage, the group of reptiles that would eventually give rise to both the crocodilians and the dinosaurs. The Archosaurs were not new in the early Triassic. They had been present in the late Permian, though not as a dominant group. They were a part of the broader category of diapsid reptiles, reptiles with two openings in the skull behind the eye socket, a structural feature that allowed the evolution of more complex jaw musculature and would prove to be an enormously successful body plan in the post-Permian world. The early Archosaurs of the Permian were relatively small, relatively unremarkable animals, lost among the more successful and abundant synapsids that dominated the Permian landscape. In the early Triassic, with the synapsids dramatically reduced and their ecological dominance broken, the Archosaurs found themselves in a world of opportunity. Several lineages began to diversify in the early Triassic, exploring the ecological space that the extinction had opened. Among these early diversifying groups were the Proterocampsids, small semi-aquatic archosaurs that lived in and around rivers and lakes, and the various erythrosuchids, larger and more predatory archosaurs that were beginning to move into the role of apex predator that the extinct Gorgonopsians had previously occupied. The erythrosuchids deserve a moment of attention, because they represent an early experiment in a body plan that would become very important later. Some of them were reasonably large animals for the early Triassic, the largest could reach 3 or 4 meters in length, and they were active predators, hunting the Lystrosaurus and other herbivores that shared their environments. What distinguished them from the earlier synapsid predators they were replacing was not necessarily their size or their hunting strategy, but rather some aspects of their skeletal structure, a skull that was proportionally large and deep, and limbs that, while still somewhat sprawling, showed signs of a posture more upright than many of their contemporaries. These are small details, the kind that matter enormously over geological time but are barely visible in a single specimen. But the trend they represent, toward more upright posture, toward more efficient locomotion, toward a body plan that moves through the world with less energy expenditure than the old sprawling reptile style, was one that would continue to be reinforced by natural selection throughout the Triassic period. Each incremental improvement in locomotor efficiency opened new possibilities for size, speed, and energy management. Each generation that was slightly more efficient than the last left slightly more descendants. Over millions of years, this accumulation of small advantages would produce something that had not existed before. Meanwhile, in the marine realm, the recovery was proceeding in its own tentative way. The ammonoids, cephalopods with coiled shells, provide one of the most striking examples of post-extinction diversification in the fossil record. They had come through the end-Permian extinction with dramatic losses, but enough species survived to maintain the lineage. In the early Triassic, those survivors began to diversify rapidly, producing new shell forms and new ecological strategies at a pace that geologists can observe quite clearly in the rock record. The ammonoids are in some ways the poster children of Triassic marine recovery, a lineage that had been nearly eliminated, rebuilding itself into extraordinary diversity in a matter of a few million years. The fish, too, were recovering and diversifying. Several groups of bony fish that had survived the extinction were beginning to explore the simplified marine ecosystems of the early Triassic, finding food resources and habitat niches that the extinction of so many other species had made available. The evolution of new fish groups in the Triassic would eventually have significant ecological consequences, contributing to the rebuilding of complex food webs in both marine and freshwater environments. On land, the small and scattered communities of early Triassic survivors were doing what survivors always do, eating, reproducing, adapting to local conditions. The simple fern-dominated plant communities of the earliest Triassic were gradually being supplemented by other plant types as conditions stabilized: seed plants, early conifers, various lycopsids that represented the beginning of the long process of rebuilding complex terrestrial vegetation. Each new plant type that established itself created new habitat for the animals that depended on plants, new ecological layering, new resources, and new shelter. One of the most important but least visible aspects of the early Triassic recovery was happening below ground, in the soil communities. The fungi, mycorrhizal fungi in particular, the organisms that form symbiotic partnerships with plant roots and are essential to the functioning of healthy terrestrial ecosystems, had suffered significantly in the extinction event and were slow to recover. Without robust fungal networks, plant communities struggled to establish themselves, and without complex plant communities, the soil-building processes that provide the foundation for terrestrial life moved slowly. The recovery of the soil ecosystem was in some ways the most fundamental recovery of all, because everything else depended on it. There is something quietly instructive in watching this process unfold from the perspective of deep time. The recovery of the early Triassic world was not being driven by any single dramatic event or any one spectacular organism. It was being driven by the accumulation of small processes, a fungal network establishing itself here, a plant root penetrating a little deeper there, a small archosaur diversifying into a slightly different dietary niche, a fish species tolerating a slightly wider range of water conditions. These individual events were invisible in terms of any ecological impact. But collectively, over millions of years, they were rebuilding a world. The early Triassic world, for all its bleakness, was a place of enormous biological significance. The evolutionary experiments being conducted here, the diversification of the Archosaurs, the rebuilding of marine food webs, the slow reconstruction of complex plant communities, were setting the conditions for everything that would follow. Every lineage that diversified in the early Triassic was doing so in a world without established competitors, a world where the old rules had been suspended and new ones were being written, one generation at a time. You can think of it this way: the Great Dying cleared an enormous canvas. The early Triassic was the period in which the first tentative marks were being made on that canvas, not yet anything recognizable as a composition, not yet a world with the richness and complexity that the Permian had achieved, but the beginning of something. The beginning of a new arrangement of life on Earth, one that would eventually produce an age so spectacular that we still, 250 million years later, find it impossible not to be awed by it. But we need patience, here at the beginning. Deep time demands patience. The canvas is still mostly white. The marks being made are small and uncertain. The creatures making them do not know what they are creating. They are simply alive, simply doing what living things do, and in that simple persistence, something extraordinary is beginning its slow accumulation. Let the quiet of the early Triassic settle around you now. Let the soft sound of those ancient rivers be present at the edge of your awareness. The world is small here, and simple, and slowly healing. And somewhere in the low vegetation of a floodplain, in the body of a small archosaur that has no idea what it is, the very faintest beginning of something called a dinosaur is beginning to take shape. By the Middle Triassic period, roughly 247 million years ago, the world had begun to look something a little more like a world again. The atmosphere was stabilizing. The volcanic activity of the Siberian traps had quieted to the point where it was no longer the dominant force shaping global conditions. The oceans were still warmer than they had been in the Permian, and would remain so for much of the Triassic, but the most extreme temperature conditions of the early Triassic were behind them. The plant communities on land had rebuilt to the point where complex vegetation existed in many regions, and with that complexity came the return of layered animal communities, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, insectivores, all beginning to fill in the broad outline of a functional ecosystem. The world was also beginning, very slowly, to reconfigure itself geographically. In the Triassic period, all of Earth's continents were still assembled into a single landmass called Pangaea, a supercontinent that stretched from pole to pole, a single connected piece of land surrounded by the vast Panthalassic Ocean. This configuration had enormous implications for climate and for the distribution of life, because a single large landmass creates very different climatic conditions than a world divided into smaller continents separated by ocean. The interior of Pangaea, far from any ocean coast, was bone dry. The monsoon circulation that brought moisture inland was limited by the sheer size of the landmass. By the time wind systems carrying ocean moisture traveled far enough inland to reach the continental interior, they had dropped their rain. The result was a vast, seasonally arid interior, subject to extreme temperature swings between hot summers and cool winters, a landscape of desert and semi-desert that was, for many groups of animals, essentially uninhabitable. Life on Pangaea clung to the coasts and the river valleys, to the highland regions where orographic lift forced moisture-laden air upward and produced rain, to the equatorial belt where persistent warmth and some moisture allowed a degree of plant growth. The distribution of life was patchy and uneven, shaped by the geography of rainfall and temperature in ways that would have been immediately visible to any observer looking down at the continent from above. But within this challenging geography, the Archosaurs were diversifying with increasing purpose. The Middle Triassic saw the appearance and early diversification of several Archosaur groups that would go on to be enormously important. The most significant split in Archosaur evolution, a divergence that would shape the history of life for the next 200 million years, was the division of Archosaurs into two broad lineages, which paleontologists call the Crurotarsi and the Avometatarsalia. The Crurotarsi were the Archosaurs that would eventually give rise to the crocodilians. They were, in the Triassic, a much more diverse group than crocodilians are today, occupying a wide range of ecological roles. Some were large, terrestrial predators with upright posture and powerful skulls. Others were smaller, more lightly built, moving through the environments of the Middle Triassic as active hunters of smaller prey. Some were herbivores, filling the plant-eating roles that the synapsids had previously dominated. The Crurotarsi were, for much of the Triassic, the dominant large land vertebrates, more diverse, more abundant, and occupying more ecological roles than their Avometatarsalia cousins. The Avometatarsalia were the other lineage, the Archosaurs that would eventually give rise to the pterosaurs, and to the dinosaurs. In the Middle Triassic, they were not yet the impressive organisms they would become. The early Avometatarsalia were small to medium-sized animals, agile and active, with some anatomical features that distinguished them from the Crurotarsi. The most important of these features were concentrated in the ankle region, a subtly different arrangement of bones in the ankle joint that would have significant biomechanical consequences for how these animals moved. The ankle is not a part of the body that most people think of as evolutionarily significant. But in the Archosaurs of the Triassic, the ankle was crucially important, because the ankle joint determines how the foot is positioned relative to the leg, and the positioning of the foot determines the angle of the limb, and the angle of the limb determines whether the animal walks with its limbs sprawled out to the sides or held erect beneath its body. The Avometatarsalia ankle joint, with its particular arrangement of bones, facilitated a more fully erect posture, legs directly beneath the body, moving in a plane parallel to the direction of travel rather than angling outward and then back inward with each step. Why does this matter? Because erect posture is energetically more efficient than sprawling posture for sustained locomotion. A sprawling animal expends significant energy simply supporting its own weight against gravity, because the limbs at an angle must exert considerable force both to push the body forward and to prevent it from collapsing sideways. An animal with erect limbs has the ground directly below the hip joint, and gravity assists rather than opposes the work of locomotion. This means that an erect-postured animal can sustain active movement for longer, can maintain a higher average speed, and can allocate more metabolic energy to other activities like growth and reproduction rather than the sheer mechanics of staying upright and moving. Over geological time, this energetic advantage would compound enormously. Animals that can move more efficiently can exploit a wider range of environments, can pursue prey over longer distances, can escape predators more effectively. They can also grow larger, because larger size requires more energy, and more efficient locomotion makes more energy available. The avian ankle is, in this sense, not just a small anatomical detail, it is a key that opened an enormous number of evolutionary doors. In the Middle Triassic, those doors were just beginning to open. The early avian were not yet large. They were not yet dominant. But they were present, distributed across the environments of Triassic Pangaea in small and scattered communities, and the anatomical toolkit they carried, the erect ankle, the increasingly efficient posture, the active and energetic metabolism, was being tested and refined by each generation's contact with the world. Among the early avian, a group called the Dinosauriforms had begun to emerge by the late Middle Triassic. These were the immediate precursors of the dinosaurs, animals that shared most of the anatomical characteristics that would eventually define the dinosaur lineage, but had not yet crossed whatever threshold paleontologists used to draw the line between dinosauriform and actual dinosaur. This is, of course, somewhat arbitrary. Evolution does not recognize the boundaries that taxonomists draw. The transition from dinosauriform to dinosaur was not a moment but a process, a gradual accumulation of anatomical changes spread over millions of years and dozens of generations. One of the most important early dinosauriforms was a small animal called Lystrosaurus, known from fragmentary remains found in Argentina. From what we can reconstruct, Lystrosaurus was a small, lightly built creature, probably bipedal, walking primarily on its hind legs, with shorter forelimbs, and probably quite agile and fast. The hind limbs show the advanced ankle structure of the avian, and the overall proportions suggest an animal adapted for quick, active movement. It is not impressive looking by dinosaur standards. It is not large. It does not have the towering form that the word dinosaur tends to summon in the imagination. But it is close. It is very close. Another important early dinosauriform was Marsuchus, also from Argentina, which lived in the Middle Triassic. Marsuchus was similarly small, perhaps 60 centimeters in length, roughly the size of a large cat, and similarly lightly built. It had the distinctive Archosaur skull and the avian ankle, and its overall anatomy suggests an active, fast-moving carnivore or omnivore. From remains like Marsuchus, paleontologists have been able to reconstruct something of what the immediate ancestors of the dinosaurs looked like and how they moved, filling in the picture of the evolutionary transition that was underway in these Middle Triassic years. What these early dinosauriforms reveal is that the origin of the dinosaurs was not a dramatic event. It was not a sudden leap from one body plan to another. It was, as most evolutionary transitions are, a gradual process of anatomical refinement, each generation slightly different from the last, the changes invisible in any individual but cumulative over millions of years into something genuinely new. The first creatures that paleontologists would classify as true dinosaurs would look, to an untrained eye, very much like their dinosauriform predecessors. The important differences were in the details, specific arrangements of bones in the hip and ankle, specific configurations of skull and limb that would, given enough time and enough generations, become the foundation for something that would dominate the Earth for the next 180 million years. But we are not there yet, not quite. The Archosaurs are diversifying. The avian are refining their anatomy. The world of the Middle Triassic is becoming more complex, more layered, more ecologically rich than the bleak simplicity of the early Triassic years. The canvas is taking on texture and color. The composition is beginning to emerge. And in the warm, semi-arid landscapes of Middle Triassic Pangaea, something that is almost a dinosaur is moving through the low vegetation, light-footed and quick, leaving footprints in the mud at the edge of a shallow river. The world does not know yet what it is making. It never knows. It simply selects, generation by generation, for what works in the conditions that exist right now, and accumulates the results, and the results become history. In the quiet of the Middle Triassic, in the warm evenings of a world still putting itself back together, evolution is at work in its patient, relentless, unseeing way. And the work it is doing will eventually produce something that will live in human imaginations for as long as humans have imaginations to fill. Rest in the warmth of that ancient evening. The air is dry and carries the smell of conifers beginning to establish themselves on the upland slopes. Somewhere in the low scrub of a floodplain, something small and quick is moving. It does not know where it is going. It simply moves, and in moving, it becomes part of the long accumulation that will, in the fullness of geological time, become an age of wonders. There is a valley in what is now northwestern Argentina, in the dry foothills of the Andes, where the rocks are colored in shades of rust and ochre that speak of ancient desert conditions. The formation is called the Ischigualasto Formation, and it is one of the most important fossil sites in the world, not because it is spectacular in the way that some fossil sites are, not because it yields the enormous, dramatic bones of large predators or the complete skeletons of famous species, but because it preserves something rarer and more significant, the very beginning of the dinosaurs. The Ischigualasto Formation was deposited during the late Carnian stage of the Triassic period, roughly 230 to 235 million years ago. At this time, the world was in transition. The Middle Triassic recovery was complete enough that ecosystems had become more complex and more stable, and the Late Triassic was beginning to see a new phase of diversification and ecological experimentation. The Archosaurs, both the Crurotarsi and the Avemetatarsallians, were continuing to diversify, filling the various ecological roles that were available in the increasingly rich environments of the Late Triassic world. It was into this world, in this valley, that some of the first true dinosaurs made their appearance. Among the fossils recovered from the Ischigualasto Formation are the remains of two animals that represent the earliest well-documented dinosaurs, Eoraptor linensis and Herrerasaurus ischigualastensis. They are not related to each other in any simple way. They represent different branches of the early dinosaur family tree, but they share the distinction of being among the oldest creatures that paleontologists classify as true dinosaurs. Eoraptor was small. Very small. It was roughly the size of a large fox, perhaps a meter in length, lightly built, with a small skull and relatively large eyes. It moved on two legs, with short forelimbs that showed the early signs of what would eventually become the three-fingered hand of many later dinosaurs. Its teeth were varied, some were leaf-shaped, suggesting it may have eaten plant material, while others were more blade-like, suggesting meat was also part of its diet. Eoraptor was, by the standards of what the word dinosaur eventually came to mean, modest. It was not impressive in any physical sense. It was a small, quick, probably opportunistic feeder, making its living in the semi-arid landscape of the Carnian Pangaean interior by eating whatever it could find. Herrerasaurus was more impressive, at least in terms of size. It was a predator, and a fairly large one by the standards of its time, perhaps 3 to 6 meters in length, with a large skull, recurved serrated teeth, and powerful hind limbs built for speed. Herrerasaurus was a serious predator in the Ischigualasto ecosystem, one of the larger carnivores present in that late Carnian world. Its body plan prefigured, in a general way, the larger theropod dinosaurs that would follow later, though Herrerasaurus's exact position in the dinosaur family tree has been debated, with some paleontologists placing it at the very base of the whole dinosaur lineage, others placing it as an early theropod. What unites Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus, despite their differences in size and diet, is a set of anatomical features that define the dinosaur lineage. These features include a specific configuration of the hip joint, in which the femur fits into a fully open, perforated acetabulum, the socket in the pelvis, rather than sitting against a solid wall of bone as in more primitive archosaurs. This perforated hip socket is one of the defining characteristics of dinosaurs, and it is associated with the fully erect posture that was the dinosaur's great mechanical advantage. Another defining feature is a specific arrangement of bones in the ankle, the advanced avemetatarsalia ankle carried to its logical conclusion in the dinosaur body plan. And there are various features of the skull and forelimb and vertebral column that, taken together, define the dinosaur condition. None of these features is dramatic in isolation. But together, they mark a boundary in the Archosaur family tree, a line on one side of which all descendants are dinosaurs and on the other side of which they are not. The Ischigualasto formation shows us something important about the early history of dinosaurs: they were not, at the outset, dominant. The ecosystem in which Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus lived was not a dinosaur-dominated ecosystem. It was an ecosystem dominated by other archosaurs, the Crurotarsi, the various non-dinosaurian avemetatarsalia, and still some surviving synapsids. The dinosaurs were present, but they were minority members of their ecological communities, not the overwhelming presences that they would become later. This is worth dwelling on. The dinosaurs did not take over the world immediately upon appearing in it. They did not arrive as ready-made dominators, sweeping aside all competitors in a burst of evolutionary superiority. They arrived small, modest, present in small numbers among many other groups, exploring their ecological niches without any particular distinction that would have marked them as the future rulers of the earth. The age of dinosaurs did not begin with a bang. It began with a small, fox-sized animal in a dusty valley, eating whatever it could find. The world of the late Triassic, in the Carnian and Norian stages, was in fact still very much a world of varied and competing vertebrate groups. The Crurotarsi, in particular, were enormously diverse and ecologically significant during this period. Among the most important Crurotarsi of the late Triassic were the Aetosaur, armored herbivores that were among the first large terrestrial herbivores to appear after the Permian extinction, filling the plant-eating roles that the Dicynodonts had occupied. And then there were the Phytosaurs, large semi-aquatic predators that occupied a role similar to modern crocodilians in the rivers and lakes of Triassic Pangaea. And the Rauisuchians, formidable terrestrial predators that were, in the Carnian and Norian, the dominant large land carnivores of the Triassic world. The Rauisuchians deserve particular attention, because their eventual fate was intimately connected with the rise of the dinosaurs. These were large, powerful predators with upright posture and deep skulls, representing the Crurotarsi exploring the apex predator niche in the late Triassic. Some of them were comparable in size to later theropod dinosaurs. They were successful, diverse, and ecologically dominant, and the fact that dinosaurs eventually replaced them as the dominant land predators is not a story of immediate competitive superiority but of a much more complex series of events that we will come to in time. But in the Carnian and early Norian stages, these competing groups were all present together in the ecosystems of late Triassic Pangaea, each exploring its own ecological niche, each contributing to the increasingly complex webs of predation and herbivory and ecological interaction that were characterizing the recovering world. The late Triassic was, from a paleontological perspective, a time of extraordinary experimentation, many different body plans, many different ecological strategies, many different lineages trying out many different solutions to the problem of living in the late Triassic world. Among the Avemetatarsalia, meanwhile, the dinosaurs were beginning to diversify from their modest beginnings. The early dinosaur lineage was splitting into what paleontologists recognize as the two great divisions of dinosaurian diversity, the Saurischia and the Ornithischia. The Saurischia, the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, included both the theropods, which were the bipedal carnivores that would eventually produce the famous large predators of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and the sauropodomorphs, which were the long-necked herbivores that would eventually produce the largest land animals in Earth's history. The Ornithischia, the bird-hipped dinosaurs, despite the misleading name, included the lineages that would eventually give rise to the horned dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, and various other herbivorous groups. This fundamental split in dinosaur evolution had already occurred by the time of the Ischigualasto formation, or was occurring during that period. Its occurrence meant that from the very beginning of the dinosaur story, there were two major evolutionary trajectories under development, a carnivorous or omnivorous bipedal line and an herbivorous line, and that these trajectories would continue to diversify and evolve through the rest of the Triassic and into the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The early Ornithischians are among the least well-known of the early dinosaurs, partly because they were small and lightly built and their delicate bones did not preserve well. But hints of their presence are found in various late Triassic deposits, small, herbivorous bipeds moving through the plant communities of the late Triassic world, probably eating low-growing vegetation and small invertebrates, present but not yet prominent. The early sauropodomorphs are better known. By the late Triassic, animals like Plateosaurus in what is now Europe were already beginning to explore the direction of large size and long necks that would eventually characterize the classic sauropods. Plateosaurus was not a small animal, it could reach 6 to 10 meters in length, making it one of the larger animals of its time, and it moved between bipedal and quadrupedal postures as circumstances required. Its elongated neck and relatively small head on a long body prefigure the direction that the sauropod lineage would eventually take, though the truly enormous long-necked giants were still many millions of years in the future. And the early theropods were establishing themselves in the predator role with increasing effectiveness. Among the Carnian and Norian theropods were animals like Coelophysis, whose remains are found in enormous numbers in the Ghost Ranch fossil quarry of New Mexico, a deposit that preserves what appears to be a death assemblage of hundreds of individuals, perhaps caught in a flash flood or a drought, their slender, graceful skeletons piled together in the rock in a way that gives us an unusually detailed picture of this early theropod. Coelophysis was elegantly built, perhaps 2 to 3 meters in length, very lightly constructed, with long legs and a long neck and a narrow, elongated skull with small but sharp teeth. It moved quickly and efficiently, its erect posture and long hind limbs adapted for sustained, energy-efficient locomotion. It was probably a predator of small vertebrates and large invertebrates, catching prey by speed and quick reflexes rather than by power. In body plan, it prefigures the general theropod design so clearly that you can see, even in this early and relatively primitive dinosaur, the outline of what this lineage was moving toward. In the warm late Triassic evenings, these first dinosaurs were moving through a world that was still not theirs, not yet. They shared it with competitors and with creatures more dominant than themselves. But they were there. They were learning the world in the way that all organisms learn it, through the accumulation of generations, each one slightly shaped by the world it finds and leaving its small imprint on the lineage that follows. The first dinosaurs were small, and they were modest, and they did not know they were the beginning of an age. Let that thought rest with you as you settle deeper into rest. The world is warm and dry and complex with the life of the late Triassic. The sun is setting over Pangaea in an evening sky that no human eye will ever see. And in the long grass at the edge of a conifer forest, something small and quick and unassuming is moving, and it is, in the most precise biological sense, a dinosaur, and it is alive. To understand the rise of the dinosaurs, you have to understand the world they were rising into, its geography, its climate, its ecology, the particular challenges and opportunities it presented to any living thing trying to make a life within it. The Triassic was not simply a neutral backdrop against which the dinosaur story played out. It was an active participant, shaping the evolutionary pressures that defined which organisms thrived and which declined, which experiments succeeded and which failed. Pangaea, the single supercontinent of the Triassic, was a world unlike anything that exists today. From pole to pole, from east to west, the land was continuous, unbroken by the ocean barriers that separate today's continents. This connectivity had profound consequences for the distribution of life. A land animal in what is now New Jersey could, in principle, walk to what is now Siberia without ever needing to cross a body of water. The barriers between populations were not oceanic but climatic, the vast arid interior of the supercontinent that separated the equatorial belt from the higher latitude regions, the mountain ranges that interrupted the flow of moisture, the great river systems that channeled movement. The climate of Pangaea was, by modern standards, extreme. The equatorial belt was persistently warm and seasonally wet, but just a little north or south of the equator, the rainfall dropped dramatically, producing the vast desert and semi-desert conditions of the Triassic interior. Further toward the poles, the climate moderated, becoming more temperate and receiving more moisture from polar weather systems, and it was in these temperate regions, what is now Europe, North America, South America, and southern Gondwana, that many of the richest late Triassic fossil deposits are found. The weather patterns of Pangaea were dominated by a massive monsoon system, the supermonsoon, that has no modern equivalent. The sheer size of the landmass created an enormous seasonal temperature differential between the continental interior and the surrounding ocean, a difference so large that the atmospheric circulation patterns it generated were on a correspondingly enormous scale. During the northern hemisphere summer, intense heating of the continental interior drew moist air in from the Tethys Sea, the ocean that sat in the gap between the northern and southern halves of Pangaea, producing intense seasonal rainfall in certain regions. During winter, the circulation reversed, sending dry continental air outward toward the coasts. This seasonal extremity meant that many regions of late Triassic Pangaea experienced pronounced wet and dry seasons, not the gentle seasonality of modern temperate climates, but dramatic alternations between flooding and drought that would have strongly influenced the ecology of the environments affected. Organisms that could tolerate or exploit this seasonality were at an advantage. Those that could not were confined to the more climatically stable regions of the world or were absent altogether. The vegetation of the late Triassic reflected these climatic conditions in its distribution and composition. In the wet equatorial belt and in the temperate zones, forests of conifers were becoming increasingly important, early gymnosperms that were better adapted to the dry conditions and seasonal water stress of the Triassic than the seed ferns and other plant types that had dominated the Permian. By the Norean stage of the late Triassic, conifers were a major component of vegetation in many regions, providing the kind of tall, structured forest habitat that would eventually support the large sauropod dinosaurs feeding in the canopy. Below the conifers, the understory was composed of ferns, horsetails, and various seed plants, creating a layered forest structure that animals could move through in different ways depending on their size and locomotor abilities. Cycads and Bonetitalians, plant groups with palm-like or fern-like forms that were enormously common throughout the Mesozoic, were establishing themselves during the Triassic as well, adding to the diversity of available plant food. The absence of flowering plants, angiosperms, is one of the most striking differences between the Triassic world and our own. Flowering plants had not yet evolved in the Triassic. The first angiosperms would not appear until the early Cretaceous period, roughly 130 million years later. The Triassic world was a world of gymnosperms and ferns and horsetails, a world of plants that reproduced without flowers, whose pollination relied on wind rather than on the elaborate partnerships with insects and other pollinators that flowering plants would eventually develop. It was a greener, perhaps quieter world in some ways, without the vivid colors of flowers, without the buzz and flutter of bees and butterflies moving from blossom to blossom. And yet it was not a dull world. The insects of the Triassic were diverse and abundant, occupying the various ecological roles that insects have always occupied: decomposers, herbivores, predators, and prey. The beetle lineage was already ancient by the Triassic, and various other insect groups were well established. Insects formed an important part of the food chain, as prey for small vertebrates and as decomposers of plant material, contributing to the cycling of nutrients that kept the ecosystem functioning. The freshwater environments of the Triassic were particularly rich. Rivers and lakes in the late Triassic were inhabited by diverse fish faunas, early frogs, and various reptiles that had adopted semi-aquatic lifestyles. The phytosaurs, which we have already encountered as important crurotarsi, were particularly successful in freshwater environments, their long snouts and powerful bodies making them effective predators in the rivers and swamps of late Triassic Pangaea. Freshwater ecosystems in the Triassic were, in many ways, more ecologically complex and diverse than the terrestrial ecosystems that surrounded them, a pattern that is not unusual in geological history, where freshwater environments often serve as refugia for ecological complexity during periods of terrestrial stress. The skies of the late Triassic were inhabited by pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to evolve powered flight. The pterosaurs are, like the dinosaurs, members of the Avemetatarsalia lineage, and they appear in the fossil record in the late Triassic, already capable of flight and already diverse. The early pterosaurs were not large by the standards of later forms, many were roughly the size of pigeons or crows, but their appearance represents one of the most significant evolutionary breakthroughs of the Triassic, the colonization of a new ecological domain, the aerial environment, that had previously been open only to insects. The first pterosaurs, animals like Eudomorphodon from what is now northern Italy, had wings formed by a skin membrane stretched between the body and an enormously elongated fourth finger of the hand. The rest of the hand had 3 free, clawed fingers that could have been used for climbing and manipulation. Eudomorphodon had a complex array of teeth, suggesting it was a fish-eater, diving into rivers and coastal waters to catch prey, and its tail was long and stiffened, providing stability in flight. In the skies of the late Triassic, these first flyers were exploring a resource, aerial locomotion, that would eventually be exploited in increasingly diverse ways over the following millions of years. Beneath the pterosaurs and beside the early dinosaurs, the Crurotarsi were reaching the peak of their late Triassic diversity. The Rauisuchians, which we have encountered as dominant predators, were now established in multiple lineages, occupying the apex predator role in many late Triassic ecosystems. These were not small animals. Some Rauisuchians, like Post-Apocalyptic from North America, reached lengths of 5 or 6 meters, making them the largest land predators of the Norian world, larger than any dinosaur of the same period. The Aetosaur, the armored herbivorous Crurotarsi, were also at their greatest diversity in the Norian stage of the late Triassic. These peculiar animals, covered in bony armor plates, with blunt beaks and pig-like snouts for rooting in the soil, were among the most common large vertebrates in many late Triassic environments. Their fossil remains are found across North America, Europe, and South America, indicating that they were a globally distributed and ecologically significant group during this period. And the synapsids, though much reduced from their Permian glory, were still present in the late Triassic world. The Dicynodonts, the Lystrosaurus relatives, had recovered somewhat from the devastation of the early Triassic and diversified into several lineages, including some that had become quite large. Placerias, one of the last of the Dicynodonts, was a barrel-bodied herbivore that could reach lengths of 3 meters and weights of perhaps a ton, a significant animal by the standards of its time. And the Cynodonts, the synapsids most closely related to mammals, were small but diverse, occupying insectivorous and omnivorous niches in the Triassic world and continuing the evolutionary experiment that would eventually produce the first true mammals. This was the world of the late Triassic in its Norian fullness, a world of extraordinary diversity, of many competing lineages exploring many different ecological solutions, of Crurotarsi and Avemetatarsallians, synapsids and pterosaurs, all sharing the varied environments of Pangaea in a complex web of ecological interactions that was, by any measure, the most sophisticated the world had achieved since before the Great Dying. And within this rich, complex world, the dinosaurs were present as a minority group, diverse already in their body plans, exploring their ecological niches with increasing confidence, but not yet dominant. The Crurotarsi still outnumbered them in most environments. The Rauisuchians were still larger predators than any dinosaur of the time. The Aetosaur were still more numerous herbivores. The dinosaurs were one group among many, contributing to the ecological richness of the Triassic world without any particular indication that they were the group from which the world's future would be built. What was about to change all of that was not something the dinosaurs did. It was something the Earth did, another upheaval, another crisis, another narrowing of the possible. And in that narrowing, the dinosaurs would find, by accident rather than by design, that they were better suited than most to survive what came next. Let the complexity and warmth of the late Triassic world settle around you as you rest. It is a complicated, layered, living world, full of creatures that are fascinating in their own right, whether or not we know their names. The air is warm, the conifers are tall, and the evening is gathering quietly over Pangaea. There is an episode in the middle of the Triassic story that does not always receive the attention it deserves, perhaps because it has only relatively recently been fully recognized and studied, and perhaps because it lacks the dramatic simplicity of the Great Dying. It is subtler, more regionally variable, its effects more difficult to read unambiguously in the rock record. But it may, some paleontologists now argue, have been the key event in the early history of the dinosaurs, the ecological disruption that first gave them a decisive advantage over their competitors. This episode is called the Carnian pluvial event, or sometimes the Carnian pluvial episode. It occurred during the Carnian stage of the late Triassic, roughly 230 to 233 million years ago, right around the time when the first true dinosaurs were appearing in the Ischigualasto formation of Argentina. And what it represents, in the most basic terms, is a significant and prolonged change in the humidity of the Triassic world. For most of the Triassic period, as we have seen, the world was relatively dry, particularly in the interior of Pangaea. The climate was warm and strongly seasonal, with pronounced wet and dry seasons in many regions and persistent aridity in the continental interior. The plant communities and animal communities of the Triassic had adapted to these conditions over millions of years, becoming calibrated to the arid or semi-arid environments that characterized so much of the supercontinent. During the Carnian pluvial event, something changed. Based on the sedimentary and geochemical record of the Carnian, paleontologists and geologists have concluded that there was a significant increase in global humidity during this interval, a prolonged period of increased rainfall, of wetter conditions, of the expansion of forest and wetland environments at the expense of the arid scrub and desert that had characterized so much of the Triassic landscape. The cause of this humidity increase is a subject of ongoing research and debate. One hypothesis connects it to another episode of large-scale volcanism, the eruption of the Rangelia Large Igneous Province, a vast outpouring of flood basalt in what is now western North America and Alaska. Like the Siberian traps before it, the Rangelia eruptions would have introduced enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, potentially triggering changes in global climate and atmospheric circulation that could have produced the wetter conditions characteristic of the Carnian pluvial event. Whatever its cause, the effects of the Carnian pluvial event on terrestrial ecosystems appear to have been significant. The sedimentary record of the Carnian shows a shift from the red beds and evaporites characteristic of arid conditions to the dark, organic-rich sediments characteristic of wetter environments. The fossil plant record shows changes in the composition of vegetation, with some of the more drought-adapted plant types being replaced or supplemented by plants better suited to wetter conditions. And the fossil animal record shows significant changes in the composition of vertebrate communities. This is where the Carnian pluvial event becomes particularly interesting from the perspective of dinosaur evolution. In the fossil record before the Carnian pluvial event, dinosaurs are rare, a minority group present in small numbers among the more diverse and abundant Crurotarsi. In the fossil record after the Carnian pluvial event, dinosaurs are more abundant and more diverse, and the Crurotarsi, while still present and still significant, are somewhat reduced in diversity. The hypothesis that has been proposed to explain this pattern goes something like this. the Carnian pluvial event disrupted the arid and semi-arid ecosystems to which many of the established Triassic vertebrate groups, particularly the Crurotarsi, had become adapted. The shift to wetter, more forested conditions changed the structure of the environments in ways that favored different ecological strategies, different body plans, different ways of moving through the world. The dinosaurs, this hypothesis suggests, were better pre-adapted to exploit these new, wetter conditions. Their erect posture and more efficient locomotion gave them advantages in the denser, more complex forest environments that expanded during the wetter Carnian. Their bipedal locomotor design, freeing the forelimbs from the demands of walking, gave them greater flexibility in the use of their hands for feeding and other activities. And perhaps, though this is more speculative, some dinosaur lineages may have been better able to exploit the new plant resources that became available in the wetter, more vegetated Carnian world. The Carnian pluvial event also appears to have been associated with a significant restructuring of marine ecosystems. Various marine invertebrate groups show turnover patterns at the Carnian boundary, with some groups declining and others diversifying. The overall direction of change in the marine realm during the Carnian was toward the more modern-looking ecosystems of the later Triassic and Jurassic, with new groups of bivalves, new forms of marine reptiles, and new types of fish becoming increasingly prominent. The marine reptiles of the Carnian deserve mention here, because they were a remarkable part of the Triassic world even if they are only tangentially related to the dinosaur story. By the Carnian stage, the oceans were inhabited by ichthyosaurs, dolphin-like reptiles that had become fully aquatic, giving birth to live young in the water, their limbs transformed into flippers, their bodies streamlined for high-speed swimming. Alongside the ichthyosaurs were the first plesiosaurs beginning to appear, long-necked marine reptiles that would eventually become iconic animals of the Mesozoic seas. And various other marine reptiles, nothosaurs, placodonts, burly turtles, were contributing to an increasingly diverse and ecologically rich marine fauna. None of these were dinosaurs, none were closely related to dinosaurs, but they are part of the larger story of the Triassic world, a world in which the reptile lineage was diversifying into almost every conceivable ecological niche, from the deepest oceans to the highest skies, from the densest forests to the most arid deserts, exploring the possibilities of the reptile body plan with a creativity that the Permian synapsids had never quite achieved. After the Carnian pluvial event, the Triassic world returned to somewhat drier conditions in its later Norian and Rhaetian stages, and the ecology of the late Triassic settled into the complex, multi-group pattern that we described in the previous section, dinosaurs diversifying but still not dominant, sharing the world with Rauisuchians and Aetosaur and Phytosaurs and all the other representatives of the rich Triassic fauna. But something had shifted. The composition of vertebrate communities had changed, and the dinosaurs had increased their presence in the ecological landscape. The Carnian pluvial event, or the ecological disruption associated with it, had given the dinosaur lineage an early boost, not a decisive one, not one that made them immediately dominant, but one that increased their diversity and their distribution across the varied environments of Pangaea. The Carnian pluvial event also, interestingly, appears to have been the context in which the first mammals appeared. The earliest definitive mammal remains, small, insectivorous animals representing the crossing of the line between cynodont and mammal, date to the Carnian stage. So the same ecological disruption that appears to have helped the dinosaurs also provided the conditions in which mammals first appeared, setting in motion two of the most important evolutionary stories in the history of terrestrial life on Earth simultaneously. There is something almost comically generous about this coincidence, as if the Triassic world, in its disruption, was making multiple bets simultaneously, launching multiple experiments that would go on to define the history of the planet. The dinosaurs would dominate for the next 180 million years. The mammals would wait in the wings for most of that time, small and nocturnal and peripheral, and then, after another extinction, they would have their own age of dominance. But both stories were beginning, together, in the warm and newly wet forests of the Carnian. In the Carnian world, if you could stand in a forest that has recently become more lush and more complex following the increased rainfall, you might see these early threads of future history all around you. Small mammals, your own ancestors, in a sense, moving cautiously through the leaf litter, nocturnal and unobtrusive. Small and medium-sized dinosaurs moving through the understory, confident in their upright, efficient gait. Pterosaurs overhead, a new form of life filling the air. And larger Cruratarsi in the background, still powerful, still present, still the dominant predators, but perhaps for the first time not quite as overwhelmingly dominant as they had been. Let the forest sounds of the Carnian world settle around you. The rainfall has made the air humid, and the vegetation is dense and green, and the ground underfoot is soft with accumulated organic matter. Something is changing in this world, slowly, in the way that all deep-time changes happen. And you are here to witness it, quietly, from the distance of 230 million years. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Nourian stage of the late Triassic, stretching from roughly 227 to 205 million years ago, is a period of increasing dinosaur diversity and ecological significance. It is during the Nourian that we begin to see the dinosaur lineage stepping more fully into the ecological landscape, producing larger bodies, more specialized dietary adaptations, more varied approaches to the problem of living in the complex, warm world of late Triassic Pangaea. The sauropodomorphs, the long-necked herbivorous lineage that was already beginning to emerge in the Carnian, show particularly rapid diversification during the Nourian. Animals like Plateosaurus in what is now Europe represent a significant step in the evolution of this lineage, animals that were already large by the standards of their time, already showing the distinctive elongated neck and relatively small skull that would become the hallmark of the sauropod body plan, already capable of reaching up into the vegetation of the late Triassic forests. Plateosaurus fossils are found in enormous numbers in certain European localities, particularly in Germany and Switzerland, where thousands of individuals have been recovered from what appear to be sites where these animals died in large numbers, possibly victims of drought, trapped in drying mud as the Triassic seasonal aridity returned after the wetter Carnian conditions. The abundance of Plateosaurus fossils makes it one of the best-studied early dinosaurs, and the picture that emerges from this study is of a large, gregarious animal that moved in groups across the late Triassic landscape of what was then the northern coast of the Tethys Sea. Plateosaurus was not yet fully quadrupedal. It could rear up on its hind legs and probably spent time in both two-legged and four-legged postures, depending on whether it was feeding from the ground or reaching up into the vegetation. Its teeth were leaf-shaped and serrated, adapted for processing the tough vegetation of the late Triassic forests rather than for catching prey. It was, in the ecological sense, a successful large herbivore, occupying a role that the surviving dicynodonts had partially filled in the early Triassic but that was becoming increasingly dominated by the dinosaurian lineage. The theropod dinosaurs were also diversifying during the Norian, producing animals with a range of sizes and feeding strategies. The Coelophysoids, the lineage to which Coelophysis belonged, were particularly diverse and widespread during this period, appearing in fossil records across North America, Europe, and elsewhere. These were relatively small, lightly built carnivores, fast and agile, probably feeding primarily on the small vertebrates and large invertebrates that were abundant in the diverse ecosystems of the late Triassic. But already in the Norian, there were hints of the larger theropods that would follow. Some Norian theropod remains suggest animals approaching or exceeding 3 meters in length, not yet the giants of the Jurassic, but significantly larger than the earliest theropods of the Carnian. The trend toward increasing body size in the theropod lineage was already underway, driven by the ecological pressure of competing with larger Crurotarsi predators and by the availability of increasingly large prey animals in the late Triassic world. Among the Ornithischian dinosaurs, the Norian record is frustratingly sparse, but enough material exists to confirm that this lineage was also present and diversifying. Small ornithischians like Lystrosaurus from what is now southern Africa, though its exact age is debated, give us a glimpse of what these early bird-hipped dinosaurs looked like, small, lightly built bipeds with simple leaf-shaped teeth adapted for processing plant material, moving quickly through the late Triassic landscape in search of low-growing vegetation. What is striking about the late Triassic dinosaur fauna is how differently the various lineages were exploring the possibilities of the dinosaur body plan. The sauropodomorphs were exploring the direction of large size and herbivory, elongating their necks and expanding their body size to exploit plant resources that smaller animals could not efficiently access. The theropods were exploring the direction of active predation, refining the bipedal, fast-moving hunter body plan that would eventually produce the great carnivores of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. And the Ornithischians were exploring their own set of possibilities, beginning the long evolutionary trajectory that would eventually lead to the armored ankylosaurs, the horned ceratopsians, and the hadrosaurids. The ecological relationships between these early dinosaur lineages and the other organisms of the late Triassic world were complex and are not fully understood. We know that the Rauisuchians were still present in the Norian as apex predators, and that they were almost certainly predating on dinosaurs, particularly the smaller species. We know that the Aetosaur were still important herbivores, competing with the sauropodomorphs for plant resources. We know that the Phytosaurs were still dominant in freshwater environments, limiting dinosaur access to aquatic resources. What we are less certain about is the precise nature of the competitive interactions between these groups, whether the dinosaurs were actively displacing the Crurotarsi from ecological roles, or whether they were simply diversifying into available niches without direct competition, or whether the relationship was more complex, varying by region and ecological context. The fossil record of the Norian provides data points, but not a complete and unambiguous narrative. What we can say with confidence is that by the end of the Norian and into the following Rhaetian stage, the last stage of the Triassic period, dinosaurs had become more prominent members of vertebrate communities in many regions of Pangaea than they had been in the Carnian. They were larger, more diverse, and more ecologically significant. They had not yet displaced the Crurotarsi from dominance, but they were positioned as a major player in the ecological landscape of the late Triassic world. The world in which they were becoming more prominent was also continuing to change. The rifting of Pangaea, the beginning of the long, slow process of continental breakup that would eventually produce the world's current geography, was underway, though still in its early stages. The North Atlantic Basin was beginning to open, a narrow seaway just starting to push northward between what would become North America and what would become Europe. The rift zones where the crust was being pulled apart were sites of intense volcanism, producing lava flows that would eventually build the extensive basalt provinces now preserved along the margins of the Atlantic Ocean. This rifting was not just a geographic event. It had climatic consequences, altering the distribution of ocean currents and land areas in ways that influenced temperature and rainfall patterns across the supercontinent. The world of the Rhaetian stage, the very last stage of the Triassic, perhaps 5 million years in duration, was a world in subtle but accelerating transition, the familiar patterns of Triassic climate and ecology beginning to shift as the geography of the planet itself began to change. In the seas, the Rhaetian shows continuing recovery and diversification of the marine fauna. New groups of bivalves and other mollusks were expanding. The ichthyosaurs and early plesiosaurs were continuing to diversify. And in the shallow coastal waters of the Tethys and Pangaea oceans, the first tentative recovery of reef-building communities was underway, the long-awaited return of complex carbonate environments to the world's oceans, more than 15 million years after the Great Dying had destroyed the Permian reefs. On land, the vegetation of the Rhaetian was shifting, with some evidence for increased humidity in certain regions and continued diversification of conifer and cycad communities. The animal communities were diverse and complex, a late Triassic world at the peak of its ecological development, full of animals that, in another timeline, might have persisted and continued to diversify for another 100 million years. But this world was about to face another crisis. Not as large as the Great Dying, nothing in the subsequent history of Earth has equaled the magnitude of the end-Permian extinction. But significant enough to reshape the ecology of the planet, to eliminate the Crurotarsi from their position of dominance, and to leave the world's terrestrial ecosystems in the hands of a group that, up until this point, had been a significant but not dominant component of the late Triassic fauna. The end of the Triassic was approaching. Another boundary in the rock record was forming, another thin layer of sediment that would someday tell geologists about what happened here. And in the warm evenings of the Rhaetian world, the dinosaurs were moving through their environments without any awareness of what was coming, feeding, hunting, reproducing, doing what living things do, in a world that was about to change around them once again. The late Triassic, for all its complexity and richness, was building toward its own end. The patterns of life that had taken 50 million years to establish since the Great Dying were about to be disrupted again. But this time, the disruption would favor a particular group in a way that nothing had quite managed before. This time, when the smoke cleared, the world would belong, in a way it never quite had before, to the dinosaurs. The Rhaetian evening settles around you, warm and rich with the sounds of a fully realized ecosystem. You are present at the end of one chapter of Earth's story, and at the threshold of the next. Rest now in the complexity and beauty of this late Triassic world, before the next great change arrives to remake it. There is a moment in the late Rhaetian stage of the Triassic period, perhaps 201 million years ago, when the rock record changes again. The change is not as stark as the thin dark band of the Permian-Triassic boundary, but it is recognizable, and what it tells is a familiar story in some ways, though different in its causes and different in its consequences. The End-Triassic extinction event is the fourth of the 5 great mass extinctions recognized in the history of Earth, and in terms of marine casualties, it was severe, perhaps comparable to the End-Cretaceous extinction that would famously eliminate the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years later. On land, its effects were more selective, more uneven in their impact, targeting some groups more than others in ways that paleontologists are still working to fully understand. What caused the End-Triassic extinction is, by the standards of geological events, relatively well understood. The evidence points clearly to another episode of large-scale flood basalt volcanism, this time the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, associated with the rifting apart of Pangaea and the opening of the early Atlantic Ocean. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province was enormous. Its lava flows are preserved today across what is now eastern North America, northwestern Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and South America, the separated fragments of what was once a continuous volcanic province that spread across the interior of Pangaea during the initial rifting of the supercontinent. The total volume of lava produced was comparable to the Siberian traps, and like the Siberian traps, the volcanic activity released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. The effects on the climate were rapid by geological standards, perhaps occurring over the course of 100,000 years, which is essentially instantaneous in geological terms, and severe. Carbon dioxide levels spiked, warming the climate dramatically. Ocean chemistry was disrupted, with the familiar pattern of ocean acidification following the influx of carbon dioxide. And the combination of warming and acidification hit marine organisms hard, particularly those that built their bodies from calcium carbonate, which becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as ocean chemistry becomes more acidic. In the marine realm, the End-Triassic extinction eliminated a significant proportion of the existing marine fauna. Many groups of reef-building organisms that had been slowly recovering and rebuilding since the end-Permian extinction were hit hard again, setting back the recovery of complex reef systems that would not be fully re-established until the Jurassic period. Conodonts, small, eel-like marine organisms with tooth-like structures that are among the most useful fossils for dating Paleozoic and Triassic rocks, went entirely extinct at the End-Triassic boundary, ending a lineage that had persisted for 300 million years. On land, the picture is more complex and has been the subject of significant research and debate. What is clear is that the End-Triassic extinction had major effects on the Crurotarsi. The Aetosaur, those armored herbivores that had been so successful through the Norean, disappear from the fossil record at or very near the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. The phytosaurs, those semi-aquatic predators of freshwater environments, also disappear. Many of the Rauisuchians disappear as well, though the pattern is complicated by the difficulty of precisely dating some fossil localities. By the time the volcanic activity had subsided and the environmental conditions had stabilized enough to allow ecosystem recovery, the landscape of the terrestrial vertebrate world had been dramatically simplified. The diverse suite of Crurotarsi groups that had dominated Triassic ecosystems, the Aetosaur, the phytosaurs, most of the Rauisuchians, various other groups, were gone. What remained, among the large vertebrates, was a much reduced and simplified fauna. And the dinosaurs were in it. The dinosaurs survived the End-Triassic extinction event. They were not unscathed, there were certainly local and regional extinctions within the dinosaur lineage, and some early dinosaur groups may have been eliminated entirely. But as a lineage, as an evolutionary entity, the dinosaurs made it through. And critically, most of the groups they had been competing with, the ecological incumbents who had been limiting their expansion through the Triassic, did not. Why did the dinosaurs survive when the Cretaceous largely did not? This question has been debated extensively, and the answer is probably not simple. It was not necessarily that the dinosaurs were somehow intrinsically superior to the Cretaceous, better adapted to survive the environmental conditions created by the camp eruptions. The end-Triassic was not a test of general biological fitness. It was a test of how well a given animal's physiological and ecological tolerances matched the specific conditions created by a volcanic catastrophe. Several hypotheses have been proposed for the differential survival of dinosaurs. One suggests that dinosaurs were better able to cope with the high-stress conditions of the extinction interval because of physiological advantages, potentially including some degree of endothermic metabolism that allowed them to maintain activity levels and body temperature under conditions that might have been debilitating for more ectothermic Cretaceous. Another hypothesis suggests that the dietary flexibility of many early dinosaurs, their ability to shift between different food sources as conditions changed, gave them an advantage over more specialized feeders. A third hypothesis emphasizes the geographic refugia argument, that dinosaurs happen to be more common in the regions that were less severely affected by the initial phases of the volcanic activity, allowing them to survive the worst of the disruption in local pockets of relative stability. The truth is probably some combination of these factors, operating differently in different regions and affecting different dinosaur lineages in different ways. Mass extinctions are not simple, uniform events, and their effects on complex ecological webs are correspondingly complex. What we can say is that the dinosaurs were there on the other side of the end-Triassic boundary, and that the Cretaceous were largely not, and that this difference in survival would determine the ecological landscape of the Jurassic world. The early Jurassic period, immediately following the end-Triassic boundary, shows a pattern somewhat reminiscent of the early Triassic following the Great Dying, a temporarily simplified fauna, reduced diversity, the ecological niches left empty by the extinct groups waiting to be filled. But the early Jurassic recovery was faster than the early Triassic recovery, partly because the end-Triassic extinction was less severe than the end-Permian, and partly because the surviving organisms, including the dinosaurs, were more diverse and ecologically sophisticated than the survivors of the Great Dying had been. In the early Jurassic, the ecological space vacated by the extinct Cretaceous groups was available, and the dinosaurs were positioned to fill it. The Rawasuchian predators were gone, the large terrestrial predator niche was open. The Aetosaur were gone, the large terrestrial herbivore niche was partially open. The Phytosaurs were gone, the freshwater predator niche was available. In each case, the dinosaurs had lineages that were positioned to step into these roles, and in the early Jurassic, that is precisely what they did. The transition from Triassic to Jurassic is, in this sense, the true turning point in the story of dinosaurian dominance. Not the appearance of the first dinosaurs in the Carnian, important as that was. Not the Carnian pluvial event, which gave them an early boost. But the end-Triassic extinction, which removed the competitors that had been limiting them throughout the late Triassic, and which left them, for the first time, as the ecologically dominant large vertebrates on land. It was not a dominance that the dinosaurs had earned through a direct competitive struggle with the Crurotarsi. It was a dominance that fell to them through the combined accident of surviving a volcanic catastrophe and finding themselves in a world where the animals that had previously occupied the most important ecological roles were no longer present. Opportunity, as much as inherent superiority, made the age of dinosaurs possible. But opportunity, seized and developed over millions of years of evolutionary diversification, can build something extraordinary. The early Jurassic dinosaurs that found themselves in a suddenly emptied world would, over the following 130 million years, explore that opportunity with an evolutionary creativity that the planet had rarely seen before. The age of dinosaurs was about to begin, truly and fully, in a way that the Triassic had only hinted at. The second silence of the end-Triassic was shorter than the first. The world was recovering faster now, the biological systems more resilient, the survivors more capable. And into the quiet left by the end of the Triassic, a familiar but transformed group of animals was beginning to spread, to diversify, to grow into the ecological space that history had prepared for them. Let yourself rest in the quiet of that boundary, that thin line in the rock between the Triassic and the Jurassic, between one age and another. The silence here is brief. Something extraordinary is about to begin. The early Jurassic period began approximately 201 million years ago, and it began with a world in recovery. The volcanic darkness of the camp eruptions was lifting. Temperatures were stabilizing. The lava flows of the Central Atlantic magmatic province were cooling to black basalt plains, geologically inert, offering their mineral-rich surfaces to the first pioneer plants that were beginning to establish themselves in the newly available ground. The oceans were beginning the process of rebuilding. The simplified marine fauna of the immediate post-extinction interval was starting to diversify again, with surviving lineages of fish and marine reptiles and ammonoids beginning to explore the ecological opportunities created by the mass extinction. The recovery of the marine ecosystem would take millions of years to produce the rich, complex communities of the later Jurassic, but the process was underway, driven by the same biological imperatives that had driven every previous recovery: the availability of resources, the absence of competition, the pressure of natural selection acting on the raw material of the survivors. On land, the early Jurassic world was simpler than the late Triassic had been, but it was beginning to reconstruct its complexity with a new cast of dominant species. The dinosaurs, spared by the selectivity of the end-Triassic extinction, found themselves in an ecological landscape that was, in a fundamental sense, theirs for the first time. The large Crurotarsi that had been their companions and competitors throughout the Triassic were mostly gone. The ecological roles those animals had occupied were empty, and the dinosaurs were present, diverse enough, and ecologically flexible enough to begin filling them. The early Jurassic sauropodomorphs, the long-necked herbivorous lineage, began their expansion into large-body territory with increasing momentum. The animals of this period were larger than their late Triassic predecessors, their necks longer, their bodies more massive, their feeding strategies more clearly optimized for harvesting vegetation from heights that other herbivores could not reach. Among the early Jurassic sauropodomorphs were animals like Vulcanodon from Zimbabwe and various forms from China and South America, animals that were beginning to cross the threshold from prosauropod to true sauropod, from animals that could move between two-legged and four-legged postures to animals that were committed quadrupeds, their bodies too large and their limbs too columnar to permit bipedal movement. The commitment to full quadrupedality in the sauropods was a significant evolutionary transition, and it was associated with the evolution of the enormous body sizes that would eventually characterize the group. A bipedal animal is constrained in maximum body size by the requirement that the hind limbs bear the entire weight of the body during locomotion. The mechanical stresses on leg bones scale unfavorably with increasing size, setting an upper limit on how large a bipedal animal can be before its legs simply cannot support it. A quadruped, distributing its weight across 4 limbs, can grow considerably larger before encountering those same structural limits. And the sauropods, freed from bipedal constraints, proceeded to grow to sizes that remain among the largest of any land animal in Earth's history. The theropod dinosaurs of the early Jurassic were also diversifying and, in some lineages, growing larger. The coelophysoids that had been prominent in the late Triassic continued into the early Jurassic, but alongside them, new lineages were emerging, animals that would eventually give rise to the great carnivores of the later Jurassic, the allosaurids and megalosaurids and ceratosaurids that would hunt the giant sauropods of the late Jurassic. Among the most interesting early Jurassic theropods were the Dilophosaurids, represented by Dilophosaurus from the Kayenta Formation of Arizona and similar animals from China. Dilophosaurus was a substantial animal, perhaps 6 meters in length, with a slender, graceful build and the distinctive paired crests on its skull that give the genus its name. These crests were almost certainly display structures rather than weapons, their thin, lightweight construction making them entirely unsuited for combat. Dilophosaurus was a predator, hunting in the relatively open environments of the early Jurassic American Southwest, and its size, larger than any coelophysoid, reflects the beginning of the trend toward greater body size in the theropod lineage that would continue throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The Ornithischian dinosaurs, still the least understood of the 3 major dinosaur divisions in the early Triassic, were also beginning to diversify more noticeably in the early Jurassic. Heterodontosaurus from the early Jurassic of South Africa is one of the best-known early ornithischians, a small, lightly built animal with heterodont teeth, meaning different types of teeth at different positions in the jaw, a characteristic that speaks to a more complex dietary strategy than the uniform tooth rows of many contemporaries. Heterodontosaurus was bipedal and probably omnivorous, its varied teeth allowing it to process both plant material and invertebrates, and its skeletal anatomy shows many of the features that would characterize the Ornithischian lineage through the rest of the Mesozoic. The Ornithischians of the early Jurassic also include the early Thyreophorans, the lineage that would eventually give rise to the Stegosaurs and Ankylosaurs. These were already showing the beginning of the armored body plan that would characterize their lineage, bony scuts and other dermal armor elements preserved in early Jurassic deposits, suggesting that the defensive strategy of passive armor was already being explored by these animals in the ecological context of a world where large theropod predators were becoming an increasingly prominent feature. The breakup of Pangaea, which had been just beginning in the late Triassic, was continuing in the early Jurassic and was producing increasingly significant geographic effects on the distribution of dinosaur lineages. As the Atlantic Ocean continued to widen, still narrow in the early Jurassic, little more than a shallow, elongated sea between the separating continents, the populations of dinosaurs on the different land masses were becoming more isolated from each other, the gene flow between them reduced by the increasing width of the seaway. This geographic isolation would eventually drive the divergence of dinosaur lineages on different continents, producing the regional distinctiveness that characterizes the dinosaur faunus of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, North American dinosaur communities different from South American ones, African ones different from Asian ones. But in the early Jurassic, the separation was not yet complete, the communities not yet fully diverged. Many of the same or closely related genera are found across what are now multiple continents, reflecting the still connected or recently connected state of the Pangaean landmass. The climate of the early Jurassic was warmer and more humid than the late Triassic had been, partly as a result of the CO2 released during the camp volcanism, partly because the breakup of Pangaea was allowing ocean currents to redistribute heat more effectively around the planet. The polar regions were ice-free, forested rather than glaciated, and the equatorial regions were tropical forests rather than the deserts that had characterized so much of the Triassic interior. The world was becoming, on average, a greener, wetter, more uniformly vegetated place. This climatic shift had significant consequences for the plant communities that the herbivorous dinosaurs depended on. The forests of the early Jurassic were increasingly dominated by conifers, cycads, and bonetitalians, with ferns and horsetails abundant in the understory and in wetter, low-lying areas. These plant communities were not simply passive resources for the dinosaurs to exploit, they were active participants in the ecosystem, their structure and distribution shaping the behavior and ecology of the animals that depended on them. The tall conifer forests of the early Jurassic were particularly significant for the sauropodomorphs. The evolution of long necks in these animals was not a random development, it was an adaptation specifically tuned to feeding in environments where food was located high above the ground, where the resources of the forest canopy could be accessed only by animals tall enough to reach them. The conifers of the early Jurassic, reaching heights of perhaps 30 or 40 meters in the most productive environments, created a resource, high canopy vegetation, that smaller animals simply could not exploit, and that the evolving sauropods were uniquely positioned to access. The early Jurassic world, viewed from the perspective of what would follow, has the quality of a beginning. It was a world in which the foundations of the great Jurassic ecosystems were being laid, the large sauropods beginning their journey toward truly enormous sizes, the theropods beginning their diversification into the apex predator roles that the Rauisuchians had vacated, the Ornithischians beginning their exploration of the armored and horned and heavily specialized body plans that would characterize them in the late Cretaceous. All of this was underway, in its early stages, in the recovered but not yet fully rebuilt world of the early Jurassic. The Middle and Late Jurassic, the period from roughly 175 to 145 million years ago, would see the full flowering of what the early Jurassic had been building. The Morrison Formation of the American West, the Tendaguru Formation of Tanzania, the deposits of Portugal and China, these late Jurassic localities would yield the fossils of the most spectacular dinosaurs that ever lived, Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus and Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus among the sauropods, Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus and Megalosaurus among the theropods, Stegosaurus among the thyreophorans. These animals were the culmination of a process that had begun with the thin dark band of the Permian-Triassic boundary, with the slow recovery of the early Triassic, with the first tentative diversification of the Archosaurs in the Middle Triassic, with the appearance of the first dinosaurs in the Carnian Valley of Ischigualasto. They were the end product of 50 million years of evolutionary work, of disruption and recovery and opportunity and adaptation, of the slow accumulation of anatomical innovations that had built the dinosaur body plan from the erect ankle of an early Ave metatarsalian through every subsequent refinement. And they would not have existed, could not have existed, without the great dying. Without the emptying of the Permian world and the slow rebuilding of life in the Triassic, without the specific sequence of events and environmental changes that shaped the evolution of the Archosaurs, without the end-Triassic extinction that cleared the way for dinosaurian dominance, the Jurassic world would have been something entirely different. The dinosaurs were not inevitable. They were contingent, the product of a particular history, a particular sequence of events, a particular set of accidents and opportunities that aligned in ways that made them possible. But they were real. And for 166 million years, they were the measure of what terrestrial life could be, in size, in diversity, in ecological sophistication, in the sheer variety of solutions they found to the problem of living in the world. The age of dinosaurs, when it finally arrived fully and completely, a world made new and extraordinary by the long process of its own making. Let the early Jurassic dawn settle around you as you rest. The world is green and warm and alive with things that are finding their way into ecological roles that have been waiting for them. The sauropods are moving through the forest, their footfalls shaking the ground in a rhythm as regular and ancient as the earth itself. The theropods are watching from the shadows, patient and efficient. And overhead, pterosaurs are crossing a sky that belongs to them as completely as the land belongs to the animals below. This is what the world became, through 50 million years of upheaval and recovery and patient evolutionary work. This is what rose from the ashes of the great dying. This is the age of dinosaurs, arrived at last, in the warm morning of the Jurassic world. The question of what made the dinosaurs so successful is one that paleontologists have been grappling with for nearly 2 centuries, and the answer, it turns out, is richer and more interesting than early researchers suspected. The first dinosaur bones were interpreted in the 19th century as the remains of gigantic, slow-moving, cold-blooded reptiles, prehistoric monsters more similar to overgrown lizards than to anything capable of complex behavior or high physiological activity. This view was wrong in almost every important detail, and the process of correcting it has produced one of the most significant revisions in the history of natural history. The question of dinosaur physiology, of whether dinosaurs were warm-blooded or cold-blooded, endothermic or ectothermic, fast or slow, active or passive, became one of the central debates in 20th-century paleontology. The traditional view, that dinosaurs were ectotherms like modern reptiles, was challenged beginning in the 1960s and 1970s by paleontologists like Robert Bakker and John Ostrom, who argued on the basis of bone histology, posture, and behavioral evidence that at least some dinosaurs had metabolic rates much closer to modern birds and mammals than to modern reptiles. The evidence they presented was compelling. Bone histology, the internal structure of dinosaur bones as revealed by thin sections examined under a microscope, showed patterns of rapid, uniform growth more characteristic of endothermic animals than of ectothermic ones. The erect posture of dinosaurs, as we have discussed, is associated with the energetically active locomotor styles of endotherms rather than with the more passive, energy-conserving locomotion of ectotherms. The predator-to-prey ratios preserved in fossil assemblages suggested food consumption rates more consistent with the high metabolic demands of warm-blooded animals. The debate continued for decades, and the accumulation of evidence has gradually led to a more nuanced picture than either the old ectotherm view or the simple warm-blooded alternative. Most paleontologists now believe that at least the more active dinosaur lineages, the theropods, and probably the ornithischians as well, had elevated metabolic rates and some degree of internal temperature regulation, though perhaps not identical to the highly efficient endothermy of modern birds and mammals. The sauropods, given their enormous size, may have maintained elevated body temperatures through thermal inertia, the simple physical effect by which very large bodies retain heat better than small ones, rather than through metabolic heat production. The evidence for elevated metabolism in theropods is now quite strong. The discovery of feathered dinosaurs in Chinese fossils during the 1990s and 2000s was transformative. Feathers, in modern birds, function primarily as insulation, maintaining body temperature by reducing heat loss from the body surface. If dinosaurs had feathers, they almost certainly needed them for the same reason. They were warm enough that maintaining that warmth against environmental heat loss was physiologically important. The feathered dinosaurs of China, preserving impressions of their integument in the fine-grained lake sediments of Liaoning province, showed that feather-like structures were present in a wide range of non-avian dinosaurs, not just in the immediate ancestors of birds. Dinosaurs like Sinosauropteryx, Microraptor, Anchiornis, and many others preserved evidence of feathers or feather-like filaments in various stages of development, suggesting that the feathered condition was widespread in the theropod lineage and possibly more broadly in the dinosaurs as a whole. This discovery fundamentally changed the picture of what a dinosaur looked like. The scaly, gray-green, lizard-like dinosaurs of older reconstructions, the ones familiar from earlier films and older natural history books, were increasingly replaced by animals with feathers, with complex integument, with the kind of vivid colors and patterns that modern birds use for display, camouflage, and species recognition. The true dinosaur, at least among the theropods, was feathered and probably colorful, a creature that would have looked, to modern eyes, at least as bird-like as it looked reptile-like. But physiology and appearance are not the whole of what made dinosaurs exceptional. The dinosaur respiratory system is another area in which modern research has revealed unexpected sophistication. Birds, the living descendants of theropod dinosaurs, have a respiratory system unlike that of any other living animal, featuring a system of air sacs that extends the lung tissue through much of the body and allows a unidirectional flow of air through the lung rather than the bidirectional flow of mammalian breathing. This unidirectional flow is more efficient than the mammalian system at extracting oxygen from the air, and it is likely related to the ability of birds to maintain aerobic activity at high altitudes and high speeds. Evidence from the vertebrae of theropod dinosaurs suggests that they possessed a similar air sac system, large pneumatic cavities in the vertebrae and ribs that would have been extensions of a comprehensive air sac system, much as in modern birds. If true, this means that the theropods, and possibly other dinosaur lineages as well, had a respiratory system that was significantly more efficient at oxygen extraction than the systems of the Crurotarsi they replaced. In environments with elevated carbon dioxide and reduced oxygen that may have characterized some early Triassic and early Jurassic environments, this respiratory advantage could have been significant. The locomotor efficiency of dinosaurs, which we have discussed in terms of the erect ankle and upright posture, was also more sophisticated than the simple mechanical advantage of vertical limb placement. The detailed anatomy of dinosaur hind limbs, the way the femur articulated with the hip, the way the lower leg was proportioned, the way the foot was structured, was highly optimized for the particular types of locomotion that different dinosaur lineages used. Bipedal theropods had proportions that, in some species, were very close to those predicted by optimal running mechanics, suggesting that natural selection had refined the theropod hindlimb toward mechanical efficiency over millions of generations. The sauropod limbs, by contrast, were columnar and pillar-like, optimized for bearing enormous weight rather than for speed. The bones of large sauropods were massive and dense, their joints constructed on a different mechanical basis from those of smaller, faster animals. But even in the sauropods, anatomical refinements, in the detailed shape of the foot, in the arrangement of cartilage in the joints, in the curvature of the limbs, suggest that the enormous engineering challenge of moving a multi-ton animal across a landscape had been addressed by evolution in sophisticated ways. The brains of dinosaurs are another area where the old picture, that dinosaurs were unintelligent, slow-reacting animals, has been substantially revised. Brain endocasts, the natural or artificial casts of the interior of the skull that preserve the shape of the brain, show that theropod dinosaurs had brains that were, in terms of the ratio of brain size to body size, more comparable to birds than to typical reptiles. This does not necessarily mean they were as intelligent as birds. Brain-to-body ratio is a rough proxy for neural sophistication, not a perfect measure, but it suggests levels of sensory processing and behavioral complexity that are consistent with the active, predatory lifestyle that the theropods clearly led. The sensory systems of dinosaurs were also more sophisticated than the old view allowed. The orbits of many theropod skulls are large, suggesting large eyes with good visual acuity, important for a predator that relies on seeing its prey. Some evidence suggests that at least some theropods may have had color vision comparable to that of modern birds, a capability that would be consistent with the complex color displays suggested by their plumage. The olfactory lobes of theropod brains were also well developed, indicating that smell was an important sense in at least some lineages. All of these physiological and anatomical features contributed to making the dinosaurs something more than simply the biggest animals of their time. They were, in many ways, more sophisticated than their Triassic competitors, more metabolically active, more sensorially capable, more behaviorally complex. The advantage they had over the Crurotarsi was not simply one of size or strength but of a suite of physiological traits that collectively added up to a more energetically efficient, more behaviorally flexible, more ecologically versatile organism. Of course, these traits did not all arise at once, in the first dinosaurs of the Carnian. They were the product of the long evolutionary process that ran from the earliest avemetatarsalia through the dinosauriforms and into the first true dinosaurs and beyond. Each generation refined the dinosaur toolkit a little further, each selection event favoring the variants that were slightly faster or slightly more efficient or slightly better at extracting resources from the environment. The end result of this long process, the fully developed dinosaurs of the Middle and Late Jurassic, were extraordinary animals by any measure. Brachiosaurus, standing perhaps 13 meters at the shoulder and weighing perhaps 40 to 50 tons, was the largest land animal that had ever existed up to that point. Allosaurus, the great predator of the Morrison Formation, was a highly refined hunting machine, its skull massive but lightened by large openings, its teeth recurved and serrated, its vision sharp and its movements quick. Stegosaurus, with its elaborate plates and spiked tail, was a complex organism that had co-evolved with the predators of its environment in ways that are still being studied. These animals, and the hundreds of other dinosaur species that shared the Jurassic world with them, were the culmination of the story that began with the Great Dying. They were what the world made when it recovered from its greatest catastrophe, what evolution produced when it was given 50 million years of Triassic experimentation followed by the clean slate of the end-Triassic extinction. They were not inevitable, but they were real, and they were magnificent. Let the warmth of that understanding settle over you as you rest. The dinosaurs were not the slow, cold, brainless monsters of old imaginations. They were active, physiologically sophisticated, behaviorally complex animals that dominated the Earth not through brute force but through evolutionary refinement across tens of millions of years. The age of dinosaurs was not an accident of size. It was the product of a deep, patient, and extraordinary biological history. Rest now in that knowledge. The story has been told from beginning to beginning, from the silence of the great dying to the roar of the Jurassic world, from the bleak simplicity of the early Triassic to the full ecological richness of an age that lasted 166 million years. The dinosaurs arose because the world made room for them, and because they were, in every way that mattered, exactly what the world needed them to be. There is a particular quality of understanding that comes from spending time with deep time, from sitting long enough with numbers like 250 million years that they stop being abstractions and start being, in some imprecise but genuine way, felt. It is not the same as understanding how long 250 million years actually is. No human mind can truly hold that number in a meaningful way. Our timescales are too short, our personal experience too limited, our cognitive architecture too thoroughly adapted to the rhythms of human lives and human seasons to comprehend geological time in any direct sense. But something else happens when you sit with the story we have been telling tonight, something more like intuition than understanding, more like a shift in perspective than a body of acquired knowledge. The story of the rise of the dinosaurs is, at its core, a story about the relationship between catastrophe and opportunity, between endings and beginnings, between the loss of the familiar and the slow, patient emergence of something new. And those themes are not confined to the geological record. They are not exclusively Permian or Triassic or Jurassic in their relevance. The Great Dying eliminated 96% of marine species. It eliminated perhaps 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. It reduced the living world to a fraction of its former self and held it there, simplified and struggling, for millions of years. By any measure, it was a catastrophe, perhaps the worst catastrophe in the 4-billion-year history of complex life on this planet. And yet, from that catastrophe came the Triassic recovery, and from the Triassic recovery came the Archosaurs, and from the Archosaurs came the dinosaurs, and from the dinosaurs came 166 million years of extraordinary biological innovation. The end-Triassic extinction eliminated much of the complex fauna that the Triassic had spent 50 million years building. The Aetosaur were gone, the Phytosaurs were gone, many of the Rauisuchians were gone, the ecological incumbents whose presence had limited the expansion of the dinosaurs throughout the Triassic. And from that elimination came the early Jurassic, and from the early Jurassic came the full flowering of the age of dinosaurs, and from the age of dinosaurs came some of the most extraordinary animals this planet has ever produced. Each ending, in the geological record, was also a beginning. Each extinction event that seems, from the inside, like a pure loss was also, from the perspective of what followed, a rearrangement, a clearing of space, a release of resources, a disruption of established hierarchies that allowed new possibilities to be explored. The Permian world was not better or worse than the Triassic world, not more or less valuable. It was simply a particular arrangement of life and ecology and evolutionary possibility, one that had its own richness and complexity, and that gave way, through catastrophe, to a different arrangement with its own richness and complexity. This is not a comfortable thought, necessarily. It does not make the losses of the Great Dying or the End-Triassic extinction easier to contemplate. The individual organisms that died in those events did not experience their deaths as anything other than endings, and the ecological communities that were disrupted or destroyed were real and valuable in themselves, not merely as stepping stones towards something else. The Permian reef ecosystems had their own beauty and complexity that was lost when they were lost, and no amount of subsequent evolutionary innovation can restore exactly what they were. But the geological record also teaches something about the resilience of life itself, about the depth of the biological imperative to exist, to reproduce, to fill the available space, to find solutions to the problems that environments present. Every extinction event in Earth's history has been followed by recovery. Every simplification of ecological communities has been followed, given enough time, by renewed complexity. Life has been knocked down 5 times in the history of complex organisms, and each time it has found its way back, in different forms, with different players, but with equivalent or greater ecological sophistication. We are the heirs of that resilience. The mammals, our own lineage, survived the End-Triassic extinction as small, nocturnal, insectivorous animals, peripheral to the world the dinosaurs were building. They survived the End-Cretaceous extinction 66 million years ago, the event that finally brought the age of the non-avian dinosaurs to an end, and from that survival they built the age of mammals in which we live. We are here, capable of studying the fossil record and marveling at the deep history of life on Earth, because our ancestors were the survivors, again and again, of events that eliminated the dominant organisms of their time. There is something humbling in this genealogy. We are not the culmination of evolution. Evolution has no culmination, no direction, no goal. We are simply the current expression of a lineage that has been finding ways to survive and adapt and diversify for 4 billion years, contributing our small chapter to a story that began before the continents took their current form and will continue, if we do not end it prematurely, long after we are gone. The dinosaurs lasted for 166 million years. Our own genus has existed for perhaps 300,000. In the deep time of geological history, we are still very new. The birds, of course, are not gone. The non-avian dinosaurs were eliminated at the end of the Cretaceous, but the avian dinosaurs, the birds, survived, and they are with us still, some 10,000 species of them, filling the skies of every continent, from the tropics to the poles. When you hear a bird calling in the early morning, or watch one cross the sky against the afternoon light, you are watching a dinosaur, a living representative of the lineage that has been present on this planet for 230 million years, since the first small Archosaur crossed the Carnian floodplain in what is now Argentina. The birds carry the dinosaur story forward into the present, into the living world, into the morning outside your window. They are the part of the Jurassic that survived the end of the Cretaceous, the part of that extraordinary biological experiment that nature chose, through the selectivity of another mass extinction, to continue. Every wing beat is a chapter of the story we have been telling tonight. Every feather is an echo of the long evolutionary process that began with the Archosaur ankle and ended, so far, here, in the world we inhabit. The fossil record that preserves the rest of the story, the bones of Eoraptor and Plateosaurus and Diplodocus and Triceratops and all the thousands of other dinosaur species that have been discovered, with thousands more certainly still waiting in the rock, is a library of the deep past, accessible to those patient enough to read it. Each new fossil that is found adds another detail to the picture, fills in another blank in the long narrative. Each new technique that is developed for studying fossils, chemical analysis of bone composition, CT scanning of skulls, isotopic analysis of growth rates, reveals new dimensions of the lives these animals led. Paleontology is a science still in the process of its own discovery, still being surprised by what the rock contains. The feathered dinosaurs of China were unknown 2 decades before their discovery. The warm-blooded, active physiology of theropods was disputed 3 decades before the evidence became clear. The Carnian pluvial event and its possible role in dinosaur diversification has been recognized only in relatively recent years. The story of the dinosaurs is still being told, still being refined, still accumulating the details that make it ever more vivid and more specific. And within that story, the most fundamental lesson may be the one about time. The rise of the dinosaurs was not a quick process. It was not the result of a single decisive event or a single moment of evolutionary breakthrough. It was the product of 50 million years of Triassic evolution, working on the raw material of the survivors of the Great Dying, shaped by environmental changes and extinction events and ecological pressures that no individual organism experienced or perceived. The world did not choose the dinosaurs. It simply made them, through the accumulated action of forces too large and too slow for any living thing to comprehend in the moment of their operation. The patience of geological time is a kind of wisdom, even if it is not intentional. The slow accumulation of small changes into large ones, the transformation of the possible into the actual through the work of millions of generations, this is how the world makes its most extraordinary things. Not quickly, not dramatically, not through the sudden imposition of something new, but through the long, incremental accumulation of something that was always potentially there, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to become fully real. The dinosaurs were always potentially there, in the genome of the first Archosaur, in the ankle structure of the first Avemetatarsalia, in the upright posture of the first Dinosauriform. They were always a possibility, encoded in the biology of their predecessors. But becoming real required 50 million years of Triassic preparation, 2 extinction events, and the patient work of natural selection operating on the raw material of survival through each successive catastrophe. You are the product of a similarly long and patient process. Not just evolutionarily, though you are that too, the current expression of a lineage 4 billion years old, but also personally, in the way that your own history has been shaped by accumulations and losses and recoveries and opportunities that each felt, in the moment, like isolated events but that in retrospect form a continuous narrative with a logic, if not a plan. The deep time of the geological record is a kind of mirror in that sense, not perfect, not directly applicable, but suggestive of a pattern that seems to apply at many scales, that catastrophe and recovery are not opposites but partners, that what is lost makes room for what is possible, that the patience required to endure the long interval between is the same patience that makes the new thing possible when it arrives. Let these thoughts be with you as you rest, not as burdens to carry but as contexts to rest within. You are part of a long story, a story that began long before you and will continue long after. The dinosaurs are part of that story too, not separate from your history but continuous with it, the chapter before the chapter before the chapter that eventually arrived at mammals and then at primates and then at whatever you are, lying here in the small hours of a night that is, in geological terms, the most recent possible moment. The world has been doing this for a very long time. Making things, losing them, making new things from what remains. The great patience of deep time is the patience of life itself, which has never yet given up, and which finds its way forward through every darkness into whatever morning is available. Let us go, for a moment, to where the story leads, not to its end, which is still many millions of years in the future from the Jurassic, but to its extraordinary middle, to the world that the long Triassic preparation made possible. Let us stand in the late Jurassic period, roughly 150 million years ago, in what is now the American West, in the ecosystem preserved in the rocks of the Morrison Formation, one of the most fossil-rich geological formations in the world, a window into the fullness of the Dinosaurian age. The Morrison Formation was deposited across a broad lowland plain that stretched across what is now the interior of North America, a landscape of rivers and floodplains and occasional lakes, bordered by upland areas to the west where the beginnings of mountain building were underway, and open to the east where shallow seas and coastal environments provided a different kind of habitat. The climate was semi-arid, with pronounced dry seasons interrupted by seasonal flooding from the rivers draining the western uplands. The vegetation was scrubby in the dry season, lush with new growth in the wet, and the landscape was dominated by conifers, cycads, tree ferns, and other Mesozoic plant types that created a world of dry browns and dusty greens unlike anything that exists on Earth today. In this world, the dinosaurs had been the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates for more than 50 million years. The Crurotarsi were not gone. Crocodilian relatives still inhabited the waterways and margins of the Morrison floodplains, but they were a minor component of the fauna, playing supporting roles in an ecosystem that was organized, at its largest scales, around the dinosaurs. The sauropods of the Morrison are among the most famous and recognizable of all dinosaurs. Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Brontosaurus, names that have been familiar to generations of children who have looked up at mounted skeletons in natural history museums and felt something shift in their understanding of what the world had once been. These animals were enormous. Diplodocus reached lengths of perhaps 25 to 30 meters, its extraordinarily long tail balancing a long neck at the other end of a relatively compact body. Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus were shorter but more massively built, their necks and bodies representing an enormous investment of bone and muscle and soft tissue that required a correspondingly enormous intake of plant material to sustain. How the sauropods fed at the scale of their size has been a subject of considerable study. Their teeth, simple, peg-like or spatula-shaped, not adapted for grinding, suggest that they swallowed vegetation whole or in large pieces, relying on gastroliths, stones swallowed into the stomach, and microbial fermentation in an enormous gut to break down the plant material they consumed. The daily food intake of a large sauropod must have been extraordinary. Estimates suggest that an adult Diplodocus may have needed to consume several hundred kilograms of vegetation per day to meet its metabolic needs. Meeting that kind of food requirement required either continuous feeding or access to extremely productive feeding grounds, or both. The long neck of the sauropods has been interpreted in various ways, as a device for reaching high into tree canopies, as a tool for sweeping across broad horizontal areas of low vegetation without moving the body, as a structure that allowed multiple feeding heights to be accessed from a single position. The long tail, its equal and opposite counterweight, was the anatomical price the sauropods paid for their feeding reach, and it was a price that evolution clearly judged to be worth paying. Moving through the Morrison landscape alongside the sauropods were the ornithopods, two-legged herbivores of various sizes, more agile than the massive sauropods, capable of cropping different types of vegetation. Camptosaurus was a common ornithopod of the Morrison, a medium-sized animal that could adopt either bipedal or quadrupedal posture, its relatively complex teeth capable of processing a range of plant material. These animals probably occupied the lower and middle ranges of the vegetation that the sauropods reached from above, creating a layered grazing system that allowed the Morrison ecosystem to support an extraordinary total biomass of herbivorous dinosaurs. The thyreophrans of the Morrison include the iconic Stegosaurus, whose elaborate dorsal plates and spiked tail make it one of the most recognizable of all dinosaurs. The function of the Stegosaurus plates has been debated for generations. Were they primarily defensive, making the animal difficult to swallow or approach from above? Were they display structures, used in species recognition or sexual selection? Were they thermoregulatory devices, absorbing or radiating heat? Modern analysis suggests that display was probably their primary function, though other functions may have contributed. The spiked tail of Stegosaurus, the thagomizer, as paleontologists call it with a nod to a Far Side cartoon that gave the structure its informal name, was almost certainly a defensive weapon, and an effective one. The spikes were long, up to a meter in some individuals, and positioned to be swung horizontally by the powerful tail muscles. Evidence that the spikes were used in defense comes from fossil specimens of the large predator Allosaurus with wounds in the tail region consistent with Stegosaurus spike impacts, and from Stegosaurus spike tips showing damage consistent with having struck bone. Allosaurus was the dominant large predator of the Morrison ecosystem, a theropod that reached lengths of 8 to 12 meters, with a skull designed for delivering powerful bites and a body built for the sustained pursuit and killing of large prey. Its teeth were blade-like and serrated, its forelimbs equipped with 3 large, hooked claws, its hind limbs long and powerful. Allosaurus was not, by the standards of later theropods like Tyrannosaurus, the most anatomically refined predatory dinosaur, but it was fully capable of taking prey the size of sauropods, and fossil evidence suggests that it did. Hunting a sauropod was presumably not a routine or easy undertaking. A large sauropod was simply too massive to be killed quickly by any known predator, and its defensive options, the weight and force of its long tail, the potential of its forelimbs, the protective effect of sheer size, were formidable. Allosaurus may have hunted sauropods by targeting juveniles and subadults rather than fully grown individuals, or by cooperative hunting behavior, or by ambushing prey near water sources where their movements were restricted. The Morrison ecosystem, with its mix of enormous herbivores and large predators, was one of the most productive and biomass-rich terrestrial ecosystems in Earth's history. The simple abundance of life that it supported, the sheer quantity of animal flesh moving through that semi-arid landscape, is difficult to imagine in modern terms. Today's terrestrial ecosystems, even the richest African savannas, do not approach the density of large animal life that the fossil record of the Morrison suggests was present. The reason for this extraordinary productivity lies in part in the plant communities that supported it. Conifers and cycads are not as nutritious, gram for gram, as the flowering plants that would later come to dominate terrestrial vegetation. But what they lacked in nutritional density they made up for in sheer volume. The forests and savannas of the Jurassic were productive enough to support herbivore populations that modern equivalents cannot match. The absence of grasses, which are among the most productive of modern plant types, is noteworthy. Grasses did not evolve until the Cretaceous period, and the Jurassic world got along without them entirely. In the rivers and lakes of the Morrison, crocodilians and other semi-aquatic reptiles were present. Fish were abundant. Turtles, lizards, early mammals, all were present in the Morrison ecosystem, though as minor components of a world that was organized, at its most visible scales, around the dinosaurs. The early mammals of the Morrison were almost universally small, the largest were perhaps the size of a modern rat, nocturnal and insectivorous, moving through the margins of the dinosaur world in the darkness and exploiting resources that the large dinosaurs could not access. These small mammals were the distant ancestors of everything that would come after the dinosaurs, including us. Their smallness in the Jurassic world was not a failure but an adaptation, a way of occupying ecological space that the dinosaurs were not using. They were present, persistent, waiting in the long evening of the dinosaurian age for the morning that would eventually be theirs. The patience that geological time teaches is perhaps most vividly illustrated by the mammals of the Mesozoic, 166 million years of patience, small and nocturnal and peripheral, until the chance came to expand into the world that was left when the dinosaurs were gone. But that morning was far in the future from the late Jurassic. The Morrison world was not waiting for anything. It was complete in itself, a fully realized ecosystem of extraordinary richness, the product of 50 million years of Triassic preparation and 50 more million years of Jurassic elaboration. It was a world that worked, that had found its ecological equilibrium, that was producing the organic raw material, the bones and shells and organic compounds, that would eventually become the fossil record from which we reconstruct its story. The dinosaurs of the Morrison did not know they were magnificent. They were simply living, eating, breeding, migrating with the seasons, fleeing predators and pursuing prey, doing what living things have always done. The magnificence is something we bring to them, looking back across 150 million years with the particular kind of appreciation that comes from knowing how the story continued, how the age that they represented eventually ended, and how much of the world they created has persisted into our own time through the birds that still fill our skies. Let the sounds of the Morrison world be present with you now, in whatever way they can reach across 150 million years. The low rumble of sauropod footfalls. The calls of pterosaurs overhead. The distant sound of a river in flood. This is where the story we have been telling tonight arrives, at the fullness of what the great dying made possible, at the extraordinary world that grew from the ashes of the Permian and the reorganization of the Triassic and the opportunity of the early Jurassic. This is the age of dinosaurs. And it is magnificent. Let that word rest with you as you settle into sleep, magnificent. A world made magnificent through the patience of geological time, through the resilience of life, through the accumulation of small changes into something extraordinary. The world has done this before. It is doing it still. And whatever morning your own sleep is preparing you for, it is part of the same long, patient, magnificent story. We have come a long way tonight, through time and through the story that time contains. We have stood on the edge of the Permian world and watched it move toward its ending. We have walked through the silence of the early Triassic, through the bleak simplicity of a world reduced almost to nothing and beginning, with immense patience, to rebuild itself. We have watched the Archosaurs diversify, watched the first dinosauriforms appear, watched the first true dinosaurs take their tentative steps across the floodplains of late Triassic Pangaea. We have followed the story through the Carnian pluvial event and the first boost of dinosaurian diversification, through the late Triassic fullness of a world rich with Cruratarsi and pterosaurs and early mammals, through the end-Triassic extinction that cleared the way for the age of dinosaurs to truly begin. We have watched the early Jurassic recovery, the expansion of the sauropodomorphs, the diversification of the theropods, the growing ecological dominance of a lineage that had, 50 million years before, been a minor component of a world dominated by other things. And we have stood, briefly, in the Morrison world of the late Jurassic, in the fullness of the dinosaurian age, surrounded by animals of extraordinary size and variety, feeling something of the weight and richness of what the long Triassic preparation had made possible. Now we are returning. Not to any particular time or place, but simply toward rest, toward the quiet that sleep offers, toward the darkness behind closed eyes where the deep past and the immediate present are equally distant, equally close. The story has been told for tonight. The bones are back in the rock where they have rested for 250 million years. The ancient sea is quiet. The early Triassic ferns are still and undisturbed. Let your body settle more fully into wherever it rests. There is nothing required of you now except to allow the process of rest to continue, to let the story we have traveled through tonight become a kind of background presence, a context rather than a content, the way that the sound of a river becomes background and then disappears into the texture of the night without ever stopping. The deep past is always present in the present, in the way that the bones in the rock are present beneath the surface of a landscape, invisible but structuring everything above them. The rock record of the earth is not somewhere else, it is here, beneath the ground wherever you are, accumulated over 4 billion years, layer by layer, each layer a moment in the long history of a planet that has been doing this for longer than the human mind can hold. You are part of that rock record, in the sense that your body is made of atoms that have been cycling through the Earth's systems for 4 billion years, that the calcium in your bones was once in an ocean, that the carbon in your cells was once in the atmosphere, that the iron in your blood was once in a star that exploded long before the sun was formed. You are as much a part of the deep history as the Lystrosaurus or the Allosaurus or the earliest Archosaur moving through the Triassic ferns. There is comfort in this, a particular kind of comfort that is different from the comfort of warmth or food or company. It is the comfort of belonging to something enormous, of being a small but real part of a story that is larger than any individual chapter in it, of knowing that the pattern of creation and loss and recovery and new creation has been working for longer than the imagination can reach. The great dying ended a world. But it also, in the patient way of geological time, began a new one. The end-Triassic extinction ended another world. And began another. Each ending was also a beginning, each loss also a clearing, each silence also a pause before the next voice. The pattern has continued. It is continuing now, in the slow movements of tectonic plates, in the gradual shifts of climate and ecology that are always underway beneath the apparent stability of the world we see from our brief vantage points. Let your breathing slow now, and let the thoughts of deep time become quieter, softer, less like thoughts and more like the feeling of depth itself, the sense of something very large and very old surrounding you without requiring anything of you, the way the night sky surrounds the earth without asking it to do anything except continue. The Jurassic world is dark and quiet now, the great sauropods resting in whatever way they rested, the theropods still in the warm night, the pterosaurs folded on their roosts in the cliff faces above the Morrison rivers. The early Triassic ferns are still. The late Permian Sea is calm, its creatures moving in the slow way of animals whose blood is the temperature of the water around them. The ancient world is resting. The deep past is quiet. And you are here, in whatever morning or evening of your own life this night falls, resting too, in the brief and real and extraordinary moment of the present. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Rest now. There is nothing more required of the night. The story has been told, and it is a long one, and it has been traveling toward this moment of quiet all along. The dark. The stillness. The slow breath. The weight of your body against whatever holds it. Somewhere in the rock beneath wherever you sleep, there are layers of sediment that once rested on the floor of an ancient sea. In those layers are the compressed remains of organisms that lived and moved and fed and reproduced in worlds so old that no human had ever imagined them until science found the bones and began, carefully, to read what they said. The dinosaurs rose from catastrophe and became something magnificent. Life, wherever it finds itself, does what life does: it reaches toward available light, it fills available space, it finds a way forward through conditions that seem, in the moment, impossible to survive. You are here. That is enough. The night is holding you. The deep past is beneath you. The present moment, which is the only one that exists, is yours. Sleep. The ancient world is resting. And so can you. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.